They wore crowns, but they couldn't sleep. They ruled empires, but couldn't quiet their minds. From opium-laced royal chambers to exiled kings numbing regret, these weren't just sovereigns, they were patients, addicts, casualties of their own kingdoms. This isn't a story about power. It's a story about the hidden cost of wearing it. These are 30 royals who turned to dangerous drugs not to rule better, but to feel less. And not one of them ever truly came back. Before we dive headfirst into the velvet-draped chaos, take a moment to subscribe. You won't want to miss what royalty looks like when the masks slip. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight? Noon? Somewhere in between? Because, if you're listening to this, something tells me you weren't planning on sleeping anyway. Queen Elizabeth I of England. She ruled an empire where the sun never set, but hers almost never did either. Elizabeth Tudor, the Virgin Queen, the lioness of Protestant England, the Iron Sovereign who faced down the Spanish Armada, had a secret little ritual before bed, a silver vial. A few drops under the tongue, sometimes more than a few. They called it poppy juice in polite court circles. In less poetic terms, tinctures of opium, laced with herbs, perfumed with lavender, and passed off as sleeping draughts by her physicians. They said she didn't sleep well, but who would when your entire legitimacy is a theological contradiction and half your court wants to marry you into submission? Elizabeth's relationship with opiates wasn't quite an addiction by 21st century standards. But then again, the 16th century didn't have standards. It had astrologers and leeches and powdered pearls stirred into wine. So when her physicians prescribed her opiated balms for what they vaguely referred to as the agitations of the spirit, nobody thought to ask whether she might be dependent. But dependency in Tudor England was easy to hide. You didn't need to stumble through alleyways or trade silver spoons for a hit. You just had to be queen. By her later years, Elizabeth's legendary beauty, fueled by layers of lead paint and crushed beetles, had begun to crack. Literally. The portraits became more stylized, the mirrors fewer. Her closest courtiers whispered that she barely ate, that she stayed awake for days at a time, that her hands trembled during audiences. Her moods darkened, her trust eroded. Her nights stretched longer, lit only by candle and the occasional velvet-wrapped phial. She wore 6 inches of white paint on her face. That much is true. What's less often mentioned is that the paste itself often contained opiates, not for cosmetic reasons, but to soothe inflammation, to make her still feel young when her joints reminded her otherwise. Pain, insomnia, grief, all met with poppy. There was grief, too, in abundance. Essex's betrayal, Mary's execution, Dudley's death. Her life was one long game of chess, and every bishop and knight she'd ever trusted had been lost to some war, some scandal, or some sickbed. Even her mind, toward the end, became its own quiet battlefield. She would sit for hours, motionless, refusing food, whispering to no one. Her ladies-in-waiting were dismissed for coughing too loudly. Her old hunting dogs were buried with royal ceremony. And at night, when the walls of Richmond Palace creaked and the fire sank low, Elizabeth reached for the same glass vial that had soothed her in her youth and now cradled her into something like sleep. The irony, of course, is that Elizabeth outlawed many foreign narcotics during her reign. Spanish shipments were confiscated, Italian apothecaries scrutinized, Catholic priests executed, some for less than carrying suspicious powders. And yet, in her own perfumed chambers, the Queen indulged in a substance just as dangerous, just as foreign as any Jesuit plot. But she didn't die from opium. She died from everything else. Old age, isolation, political entropy. The wear and tear of half a century spent pretending she wasn't human. In the end, she refused to go to bed, literally. She stood for nearly 2 days straight before collapsing, convinced if she lay down, she would never rise again. She was right. The throne did not mourn long. James of Scotland took it with practiced detachment, but England did not forget. They remembered a queen who outlived her enemies, who turned virginity into myth, and who never let anyone, parliament, pope, or physician tell her what she could or couldn't take to feel better. There's something poetic in it. A monarch who ruled by image, undone not by scandal or battle, but by something slow and silent, by the very same thing that soothed her into myth. A few drops of forgetfulness, brewed in an age that could neither diagnose nor name it. And speaking of monarchs who consumed the forbidden in pursuit of something greater immortality, perhaps it's time to head east, where another ruler, half a world away, believed he had found the secret to eternal life in a chalice of poison. Emperor Jiajing of Ming China. In the Forbidden City, behind vermilion walls and dragon-carved pillars, there lived a man who wanted to live forever, and died trying. Emperor Jiajing of the Ming Dynasty, the longest reigning emperor of his line, spent most of his 45 years on the throne not ruling, not warring, not even governing, but alchemizing. Or at least, pretending to. He was obsessed with Taoist immortality rituals, and by obsessed, we don't mean he kept a few incense sticks around. We mean he transformed the imperial court into a giant, taxpayer-funded laboratory of spiritual elixirs, herbal poisons, mercury-laced brews, and opium-touched concoctions that would make modern toxicologists scream into a scroll. Jiajing believed that death was not inevitable, only ordinary. And he was not ordinary. He was the Son of Heaven. So instead of tending to statecraft, or peasant revolts, or Mongol incursions, he spent his time consuming increasingly experimental elixirs said to lighten the body and suspend the breath. What they mostly did was melt your liver and rattle your nerves. But in 16th century China, science bent to power, and no one told the emperor his immortality juice was actually slow-motion suicide. What's especially chilling is that Jiajing didn't even like ruling. He hated it. From the start, he found the daily rituals of bureaucracy beneath him, court audiences, state documents, the whole Confucian 9 yards. He preferred seclusion. He transformed entire sections of the palace into private alchemical sanctuaries. Ministers would wait days for his signature on critical documents. Some never got it. He'd be busy meditating in silk robes while sipping an elixir brewed from crushed pearls, cinnabar, and depending on the recipe, raw opium resin mixed with deer musk and bat guano. That last ingredient isn't a metaphor. His physicians genuinely believed that consuming rare and grotesque substances drew vital essence into the body. The rarer, the better. Immortality, in other words, had a price. And it wasn't metaphorical. It was measured in ounces of mercury. The records are hazy. Ming historians were careful with royal embarrassment, but we know this much. Jiajing's behavior became increasingly erratic. He'd go weeks without speaking to anyone. He imposed bizarre court taboos. Servants were forbidden to look him in the eye, speak his name, or breathe too loudly in his presence. Ministers were executed for minor slights. He installed vast Taoist temples within the palace, staffed by mystics who assured him his latest potion would unlock the celestial gates. And then there were the girls. In his later years, the emperor became convinced that the essence of young maidens could extend his life. Not metaphorically, literally. He demanded pure girls be sent to the palace in waves. They were housed, not taught, selected, not protected. Most were discarded. A few, it said, were given to the emperor to help stabilize his yang energy. He believed their proximity would restore his failing qi, damaged by decades of heavy metal toxicity and psychoactive herbs. But it didn't. His body weakened. His moods worsened. Paranoia set in. He trusted no one. He saw omens everywhere. One day, he declared the moon had turned its face against him. Another day, he claimed he could taste death in the tea. And perhaps he could. Because the elixirs weren't working. His intestines began to fail. His gums blackened. His skin grew sallow. His pupils dilated at random. These are the symptoms we now associate with mercury poisoning and chronic opiate use. At the time, they were seen as signs that his body was transitioning between earthly and celestial states. A noble translation for what was, quite simply, chemical collapse. He died in 1567, not with divine light, but in convulsions, at least according to the very unofficial court whispers. Officially, he transcended the earthly realm, and in a way, he did. He left behind a country weakened by neglect, a treasury drained by potions, and a court that had learned to survive not by loyalty, but by silence. Jia Jing's legacy wasn't a golden throne or a righteous edict. It was a mausoleum filled with empty bottles, powdered stones, and failed alchemical blueprints. But here's the twist. He wasn't entirely wrong. Some of the substances he used did have psychoactive effects. Some of the rituals calmed him. Some probably numbed the fear of death. The same way a glass of wine might dull a headache. The same way a poppy tincture might make a queen forget the betrayal of her council. In the pursuit of immortality, Jia Jing didn't find forever, but he did find a chemical kind of peace. And once you taste that kind of silence, reality starts to feel like a very loud mistake. And yet, his story is tame compared to the next royal on our list, a man who reigned with silk and blood, who drowned his paranoia in scented opium and bathed in lustful hallucinations. A sultan so feared, so volatile, they gave him a nickname no monarch wants, the Mad. If you're still with us after that descent into royal unraveling, you're exactly the kind of night thinker we make these stories for. Go ahead and subscribe. This rabbit hole only gets deeper from here. And while you're at it, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? 3 a.m? Sunset? Because monarchs aren't the only ones haunted after dark. Sultan Ibrahim of the Ottoman Empire. When your own court calls you Ibrahim the Mad, history usually doesn't remember you for your tax reforms. Sultan Ibrahim, I ruled the Ottoman Empire from 1640 to 1648. And in that short span of years, he managed to earn himself a reputation that still echoes through the dusty corridors of Turkish palaces and European rumour mills alike. He wasn't born mad, they say. He was made that way, one locked door, one poisoned sweet, one opium-laced aphrodisiac at a time. You see, before he ever wore the turban of state, Ibrahim spent the better part of 2 decades in what was known somewhat delicately as the cafes, or the cage. It wasn't an iron bar prison. Exactly. It was worse. A gilded, velvet-lined, silken nightmare built into the heart of the imperial palace. Here, princes were confined in luxurious isolation, forbidden from seeing the world, making decisions, or crucially trusting anyone. It was a well-intentioned horror show, meant to prevent royal assassinations by preemptively locking away all potential heirs until they were needed. Ibrahim was needed in 1640 when his older brother, Sultan Murad IV, a man so terrifying he banned coffee and executed poets, finally died. They found Ibrahim in a haze of incense, staring at the floor, unsure whether his brother's death was real or another test. His first reaction to the news? Paranoia. He reportedly refused to leave the cage unless someone physically dragged him to the throne room. Once crowned, however, he quickly realized that being sultan came with a different sort of confinement. One dressed in velvet, yes, but also drowned in expectations, enemies, and overwhelming sensory noise. And he didn't like the noise. So, like many before him, he reached for the quiet. For Ibrahim, the quiet came in the form of pills, powders, oils, and perfumes, a rotating menu of court-approved mood stabilizers and ritual aphrodisiacs. Many of them contained opium, mixed with ambergris, saffron, and crushed pearls. These concoctions were both medical and mystical. The court healers called them soothing tonics for the divine temperament. What they really were was a 17th century pharmacological fantasy, equal parts tranquilizer, stimulant, and illusion. Under the influence of these tinctures, Ibrahim became unpredictable, at times euphoric, charitable, generous to a fault, other times paranoid, disoriented, furious over imagined slights. Ministers would arrive to discuss trade policy and find him feeding coins to birds in the courtyard, or throwing them into the Bosphorus to see which ones would float. He grew obsessed with smells: lavender, jasmine, musk. But not in moderation. Entire rooms were transformed into aromatherapy vaults. He would reportedly refuse to speak to anyone who didn't smell of rosewater. At one point, he decreed that all palace concubines be bathed in a specific blend of amber and narcotic oil before entering his presence. And then there were the rituals. Long, elaborate ceremonies designed to cleanse the spirit and align the inner stars. They often involved trance-like states, incense-heavy chambers, and, of course, opiate-laced substances meant to expand perception. Whether or not these rituals were religious, magical, or simply indulgent, no one dared ask. Not when the Sultan's moods could swing from exalted to furious in the space of a breath. Eventually, Ibrahim's detachment from reality began to affect the empire. Lavish spending on personal indulgences drained the treasury. Naval fleets were neglected. Governors were replaced based on dream visions. The economy faltered. Wars loomed. But in the imperial court, no one moved unless it was under layers of perfume and ritual silence. Historians argue about how much of Ibrahim's behavior was due to mental illness, how much was trauma from the cafes, and how much was chemically induced through years of psychoactive concoctions. The answer, most likely, is all of it. His body was real, his paranoia was real, and the drugs softly sanctioned, lovingly administered blurred the line between the two until there was no line left. In the end, his own family had enough. A fatwa was issued. His mother, who had once helped stabilize his reign, now supported the move to remove him. He was dethroned in 1648, locked away once more, and quietly executed not long after. But Ibrahim never truly left. His scent lingered in the palace halls for months, literally. The layers of perfume he demanded had soaked into the cushions, the drapes, the walls. Future sultans reportedly ordered rooms to be scrubbed clean of his oils, his tinctures, his memory. But memory doesn't wash off that easily, especially not the kind steeped in irony. Here was a man raised in isolation, freed into chaos, who used drugs not to escape power, but to survive it. And in doing so, he became the very thing the empire feared most, a ruler with no rules, no filter, and no exit plan. But if Ibrahim sought silence in scent and sedation, the next royal found his release in brandy, barbiturates, and bitter regrets an English king so decadent his liver gave out long before the crown did, King George IV of the United Kingdom. When George IV finally ascended the British throne in 1820, he'd already spent the better part of his life rehearsing for the role lavishly, theatrically, and very, very intoxicated. He was the kind of monarch whose appetite could never quite be separated from his anxiety, whose grandeur masked deep insecurity, and whose addictions were dressed up as personality traits. By the time he officially became king, he was already a national punchline, a fashion icon, and a walking medical case study. The British public called him the first gentleman of Europe. His doctors just called him a difficult patient. George's weapon of choice was a cocktail of alcohol and laudanum, an opium-based tincture that in Regency-era England was prescribed as casually as a cup of tea. Which is fitting, because George drank both in equal industrial quantities. He wasn't just a king who enjoyed indulgence. He was a king who required it. A man whose court was scented with perfume, lacquered in French furniture, and flooded with imported wine, and whose body was quietly rotting under the weight of it all. From his youth, George had shown signs of excess. As Prince of Wales, he famously racked up astronomical debts not just in gambling halls and mistresses, but in apothecaries. He would send for mixtures to help him sleep, to help him wake, to calm his nerves, to stimulate his appetite, to dull his aches, and, most of all, to forget how much of his life was orchestrated by other people. It didn't help that he was stuck in the strangest role in British politics, the perpetual heir. His father, George III, lived a long life punctuated by bouts of mental illness, during which the younger George served as Prince Regent. This meant he ruled in practice but not in name, which left him with all the burdens of monarchy and none of the clean authority. It also meant that he spent years in a political limbo, waiting to become something he already was. So he drank, and dosed, and reclined on gilded sofas while his physicians brought him glass after glass of laudanum-laced sherry and politely averted their eyes as his health collapsed in slow opiated circles. There was gout, of course, that royal disease, but with George IV, it became an epic. By middle age, he was so swollen with inflammation and weight that he couldn't walk unaided. His robes were tailored to conceal not just his size, but the bandages wrapped around his ulcerated legs. He took opium for the pain, then more for the insomnia the opium caused. Then, still more when the political headaches started again. And there were always headaches. Parliament didn't like him. The public mocked him. His wife, Queen Caroline, refused to play the role of quiet consort, and their bitter, tabloid-level feud became one of the great national spectacles of the age. He tried to bar her from his coronation. She tried to crash it anyway, and the British people, ever fond of irony, sided with her. It would be funny if it weren't so sad. A king, once praised for his charm and elegance, now groaning in pain behind velvet curtains, slurring through speeches, barely able to sit through a state dinner without medical assistance. And yet, even at his worst, he insisted on performing monarchy. His court was a stage, his body a costume. His mind increasingly numb from the constant chemical cushion his doctors had long since stopped questioning. His medical records from the period such as they exist read like the inventory of a collapsing apothecary: opium, laudanum, brandy, morphia, powdered rhubarb, antimony, and something referred to only as the nightly draught, which historians suspect was a rotating mix of sedatives, stimulants, and whatever it took to keep the king upright long enough to wave from a carriage window. By the time he died in 1830, George was hardly a man anymore. He was more myth than monarch, a bloated, powdered relic of an era trying to forget itself. His death certificate listed heart failure. But everyone knew the truth. He'd been dying for years, just very expensively. What's remarkable isn't how he died, but how he lived. George IV was a man who understood the value of distraction. He knew that perception was power, that if he just kept the chandeliers lit, the orchestra playing, and the wine flowing, the cracks wouldn't show. But they did show. And behind them, beneath the gold leaf and brocade, was a lonely man with a swollen heart and a cabinet full of tinctures he could never quite live without. Still, he was hardly alone in his decline. Across the sea and down the Nile, another prince watched his own kingdom fall apart from a velvet couch draped in opulence, haunted by exile and clinging to the same quiet enemy. A drug strong enough to make him forget he'd already lost it all. Crown Prince Asfaw-Wasson of Ethiopia. In exile, royalty doesn't vanish, it curdles. It sits in marble hallways and diplomatic apartments, quietly evaporating behind heavy curtains and colder stairs. And no one knew the slow, ceremonial corrosion of exile quite like Crown Prince Asfaw-Wasson of Ethiopia. Once the heir to a 1,000-year-old empire, Asfaw-Wasson was born into the deep, ancient rhythms of the Solomonic dynasty, an institution that claimed direct descent from King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, with just enough regal confidence to say it like a fact, not a legend. He was raised to rule, draped in embroidered cloth and incense, taught to pray in Ge'ez, speak in perfect French, and govern with a sense of divine inevitability. But divinity, it turns out, is fragile under modern geopolitics. The fall came slowly, then all at once. In 1974, a Marxist military coup unseated his father, Emperor Haile Selassie, and dismantled the monarchy with a single televised broadcast. The dynasty that had weathered centuries of war, colonization, and religious intrigue was now officially irrelevant. Asfaw-Wasson, having already suffered a massive stroke years earlier, was flown to Switzerland for medical treatment. He never returned to the throne. Not really. Not physically. Not spiritually. What he returned to was a life of quiet disintegration. For decades, he lived in polite displacement, first in Geneva, then London, then eventually back in Addis Ababa, but never in power, only in name. And it's in this long, slow freeze frame of history where his dependencies began to grow. He was not a loud man, not one for drama or theatrics, but he was surrounded by ghosts, his father's memory, his lost country, his broken legacy, and with those ghosts came pain. Physical, yes. The after effects of the stroke left him partially paralyzed and prone to recurring neural episodes. But the deeper pain was quieter, the ache of watching the world move on without you. The doctors prescribed relief, and the relief came in bottles labelled legal, and sometimes laced with more than just healing intentions. By the 1982nd, those close to the prince noted a steady pattern. Medications that blurred into routine, and routines that blurred into reliance. There was talk, polite, whisper-level talk of alcohol too, nothing scandalous. Just the kind of habit that starts with an evening glass and ends with cabinets filled with things you no longer question. To call it addiction feels clinical, but dependence? Yes. A deep, physical and psychological leaning on whatever would still the tremors and soften the regret. Because that's the thing about exile, it doesn't just take your home, it takes your timeline, your sense of what your life was supposed to be. And when the world forgets you were once the future of an empire, it's hard not to want a little forgetting of your own. Asfaw Wasson rarely spoke publicly during this time. He left no scandalous memoir. He gave no fiery interviews. But those who visited him noted the stillness, the slightly delayed responses, the careful control of mood and language, like a man perpetually balancing on the edge of some invisible cliff. The stroke explained some of it. The medication explained more. Meanwhile, Ethiopia was unraveling. Civil war, famine, dictatorship. And in the middle of it all sat a crown prince in exile, watching it unfold from European balconies, with news clippings in one hand and prescription notes in the other. His role in history had been paused indefinitely, but his body, fragile, loyal, and increasingly exhausted, kept playing its part. He was finally allowed to return to Ethiopia in the early 1992, when the political climate thawed enough for ceremonial gestures. By then, he was more myth than man. He took the title Emperor in Exile, though few used it. He lived modestly, rarely left home, and remained under medical care for the rest of his life. There's a kind of quiet dignity in that, but also a heavy sadness. A man bred for rule, reduced to memory, still alive but no longer relevant. That's not an easy role to play. And so, the soft chemical hush of daily pharmaceuticals became not an escape, but a kind of survival, one dose at a time. Asfaw Wasson died in 1997. Not with trumpets, not with revolution, just quietly, like the end of a chapter no one realized had already closed. But his story isn't unique. In fact, it echoes all the way to the polished lacquered walls of a palace farther east, where another royal court once bathed itself in luxury, while a woman in power quietly sipped from the same bitter cup, an empress surrounded by opium smoke, both allowing it and possibly inhaling more than just its political consequences. Empress Dowager, Cixi of Qing China. Power has many fragrances. In the late Qing dynasty, it smelled like sandalwood, camphor, and smoke. Not the kind rising from incense burners in ancestral halls, but the sweeter, stickier kind that clung to curtains, silk robes, and fingertips. That smoke, of course, came from opium. And while Empress Dowager Cixi's personal relationship with the drug remains one of the more delicate mysteries of her reign, one thing is certain. She ruled from within a haze, whether political, cultural, or something far more intoxicating. Cixi didn't begin life in power. She was a low-ranking concubine in the imperial court of the Xianfeng emperor, with little more than a name and a clever stare. But she rose brilliantly, ruthlessly, with the kind of strategic elegance that few women in Chinese history ever wielded. By the time she was in her 40s, she was not merely a regent. She was China itself, disguised in embroidered robes and polite titles. Officially, she ruled through her son and later her nephew. In practice, she answered to no one. And yet, her court was saturated with a substance that was slowly eroding the empire from within. Opium had arrived in China centuries earlier, but by the mid-1800s, it had become more than a social habit. It was a national affliction. Foreign traders, especially the British, flooded the market with cheap, potent imports. The drug poured through ports, alleys, tea houses, and eventually palace gates. By the time Cixi took the reins of power, opium was everywhere. In courtier sleeves, in servants' quarters, in the golden pipes of eunuchs and minor princes. Now, whether Cixi herself smoked opium remains debated. Official histories, unsurprisingly, say no, emphatically. They paint her as a conservative Confucian matriarch who tolerated the drug's presence at court, but abstained herself like a school principal turning a blind eye to the back row of the classroom. But unofficially, the rumors tell a different story. They say that late at night, long after the ceremonial audiences ended and the scrolls had been read, a servant would bring a small tray. That the Empress, known for her taste in luxury and her deep insomnia, occasionally indulged in a custom blend of herbal relaxants. Some contained opium oil, laced into the tea. Others were more direct. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that left a trail. Just enough to blur the edge between ruling an empire and surviving it. And really, can you blame her? Cixi's court was a pressure cooker of paranoia and pageantry. Assassination plots were not distant memories but daily considerations. Ministers smiled with their mouths and betrayed with their seals. The dynasty was crumbling under external pressures, foreign concessions, humiliating treaties, rebellions, and internal rot. Through all of it, she held the center, sometimes with force, sometimes with beauty. Sometimes, perhaps, with the help of a little temporary stillness in a jade cup. But more importantly, she allowed it. She allowed the court to drift deeper into a kind of ornamental numbness. Opium wasn't just a substance, it was a culture, a whole way of moving through the world, slowly, dreamily, detached. Officials who should have been drafting reforms spent hours in opium dens tucked within the Forbidden City. Military commanders came to meetings half-stupid, lips blackened. The rot was visible. And yet, under Cixi's long, lacquered fingernails, it was tolerated. Why? Partly because opium brought calm in a time of chaos, partly because banning it outright would have caused political upheaval she couldn't afford. And partly because she understood something crucial. Appearances mattered more than substance. You could be crumbling from the inside, but as long as the outer shell glittered, no one would dare look closer. So the imperial portraits continued. The lanterns stayed lit, the eunuchs whispered, and the empire kept moving sideways, backward, never forward. Reformers begged for modernization. She resisted. Or delayed, or selectively nodded, always in control, but always just a little slowed, like a candle burning with too much oil. In her final years, her health declined, and rumors began to spread again, not just about opium, but about sedatives, sleeping concoctions, exotic balms from the south. Some claimed she had become dependent. Others said she had simply learned to manage pain in the most royal way possible, without complaint, without public confession, and always behind a silkscreen. She died in 1908, still in power, still feared, still misunderstood. The dynasty followed her a few years later. When the Forbidden City finally opened to commoners, many found the remnants of a world long vanished. Gilded pipes, herbal jars, decorative trays. Nothing directly implicating the Empress, of course. But the atmosphere lingered an empire dissolved in smoke. And yet, her shadow didn't end there. Because across the frozen steppes of Russia, another royal household had discovered their own chemical cure for unrest. A household ruled not by one woman, but by a family leaning quietly and fatally into the arms of medicine. And in their case, the addiction was less rumored and far more visible. Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. When people speak of the fall of the Romanovs, they usually mention gunshots, revolution, Rasputin, or a basement in Ekaterinburg. What they don't talk about, at least not often, is the quiet pharmaceutical drift that had already taken hold in the imperial palace, long before the world outside turned red. It didn't begin with an overdose. It didn't end with a scandal. It simply crept in, soft and polite, like a well-dressed doctor with a pocket full of vials. Tsar Nicholas II, the last emperor of Russia, wasn't addicted to anything in the way tabloids prefer. He wasn't found in a stupor. He didn't fall down palace stairs under the influence. He wasn't that kind of tragic. He was a different kind. The kind whose household slowly slid into a dependency on painkillers, sedatives, and opiate-based remedies, all under the seal of medical necessity and the illusion of control. It started innocently, as it always does. Nicholas, a reserved man by nature, was not physically fragile, but his household was filled with fragility. His son, Alexei, the long-awaited heir, was born with hemophilia, a condition as terrifying as it was untreatable in the early 20th century. Every bruise could become a crisis. Every stumble, a silent emergency. The royal family, proud and deeply private, turned to medicine, and then, when medicine failed, to mysticism. And somewhere in between those two poles, they found the familiar grey zone, a place filled with opiates, sedatives, and physician-approved numbness. The Empress Alexandra was the beating heart of this transformation. Deeply anxious, devoutly spiritual, and chronically unwell herself, she was prescribed increasing amounts of pain relief tinctures over the years. These remedies, some homemade, some imported, contained laudanum, morphine, and bromide compounds, all masked under labels like nerve tonic and soothing elixir. Court physicians, desperate to calm her nerves during the endless episodes of her son's illness and the empire's political unraveling, kept the vials coming. Nicholas didn't protest. In fact, he welcomed it. Anything that could stabilize the Empress was a blessing. Anything that could take her from hysterics to composure, from night terrors to dinner table appearances, was quietly accepted. And in time, even he began to partake, though in moderation. He suffered from headaches, fatigue, and the peculiar weight of being the last absolute monarch in Europe, while pretending not to hear the thunder of revolution growing louder outside the gates. The dosage was always just enough. Not too much, never that. The Romanovs were always too refined, too carefully measured. There were no messy breakdowns, just careful, gradual dependencies that emerged as habits. A cup of something before bed, a small ampule before travel, a capsule before facing a public that had long since turned cold. What made it all worse, or better, depending on one's view, was the presence of a man who claimed to need no medicine at all. Grigory Rasputin, the infamous mystic who wrapped himself around the imperial family like a velvet rope, promised healing through prayer, hypnosis, and presence. And, strangely, it sometimes worked. Alexei's bleeding episodes occasionally subsided after Rasputin's interventions, something historians now suggest may have had less to do with magic and more to do with the suspension of certain medications. The very opiates that may have been exacerbating the boy's condition were briefly withheld, and Rasputin reaped the credit. But in this palace of whispered miracles and soft chemicals, dependence wasn't just physical. It was emotional, political, spiritual. The imperial family became wrapped in layers of superstition, sedatives, and a slow detachment from the Russia outside their windows. As food riots swept the cities and soldiers mutinied in the trenches, the Romanovs turned inward. They prayed, they dosed, they waited. Nicholas was not a fool. He was stubborn, yes, detached, often, but he understood that things were unraveling. He wrote it in his diaries, briefly, codedly, in phrases like, "My head is not clear today," or "a difficult mood in the palace." He never mentioned the medications directly, but the patterns were there. When Alexandra's anxiety spiked, the doctor would visit more often. When Alexei was injured, the household slipped into a fog of tinctures and whispered reassurances. When Rasputin arrived, the bottles were pushed aside for a time. Even in exile, after abdication, the prescriptions continued, not as indulgence now, but as necessity. The family, held in confinement, was given small freedoms, books, music, medical attention, and in those final months, the pattern held: headaches, fatigue, old injuries, new vials. The medications were fewer, but still there, a ghost of the imperial habit that had taken root years earlier. They weren't addicts, perhaps, not in the way the modern world defines it, but they were dependent on relief, on routines, on the delicate promise that anything could make them feel a little less powerless. And they weren't the only royals drifting toward oblivion in a scented room. Because not far from the old streets of Cairo, another monarch, this one exiled not by revolution, but by indulgence, was living his final years in silk and shadows. A king who had once ruled Egypt and now ruled only over memory, appetite, and the substances that dulled them both. King Farouk of Egypt. There are kings who rise with empires and kings who fall with them. King Farouk of Egypt managed to do both, all before the age of 45. His reign was a carousel of contradictions, luxury in the face of poverty, Western suits in an Eastern palace, promises of reform drowned under floods of extravagance. And when the throne was finally pulled out from beneath him, he didn't crash so much as glide directly into a life of velvet-draped exile, where the sharpest cuts came not from revolutionaries, but from his own inability to stop seeking comfort in excess. Born into royalty in 1920, Farouk was groomed for power like a prized orchid, shielded, nourished, inspected from every angle. His father, King Fuad I, ensured his education was a carefully managed cocktail of Islamic tradition, European refinement, and courtly insulation. He was sent to the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich in England, but returned early after his father's death thrust the 17-year-old onto the throne of one of the most strategically important nations in the Middle East. The public welcomed him as a modern pharaoh, young, handsome, multilingual, and photogenic. He seemed like the answer to a country caught between colonial residue and nationalist yearning. But inside the palaces of Abdeen and Ras El Tin, something else was forming. An appetite. Not just for food, though that was the most visible, but for distraction, for pleasure, for oblivion. Farouk didn't want to govern so much as float. He surrounded himself with entertainers, collectors, astrologers, imported automobiles, and endless courses of French cuisine. What started as royal indulgence gradually morphed into dependency on lifestyle, yes, but also on the substances that made that lifestyle tolerable. Accounts from the time speak delicately, as they always do when monarchy meets decline. They describe medical treatments for insomnia, digestive issues, stress. But behind the euphemisms was a clear pattern: increasing use of sedatives, opiate-infused tonics, and alcohol, especially after his forced abdication in 1952. Once exiled, first to Italy and later Monaco, Farouk became the kind of man whose palace shrank to a suite, whose throne was replaced by an overstuffed armchair, and whose court reduced to a few loyal aides, an ever-growing wardrobe, and a long line of waiters bringing glass after glass of what he used to call remedies. He wasn't the caricature people like to imagine, not always. Beneath the swollen portraits and tabloid tales was a man deeply wounded by humiliation. He had been raised to believe in divine kingship, told from childhood that the Nile itself respected his bloodline. And now he was a curiosity snapped by paparazzi on the streets of Rome, ridiculed for his weight, whispered about in nightclubs where old monarchs nursed ancient pride and aging addictions. He still played the part, though. In public, he wore tailored suits and slicked back hair. He dined at the finest restaurants, ordered vintage wines, kept a walking cane even when he didn't need one. But in private, the pattern of sedation returned. Former attendants and family acquaintances spoke, later, of the pills, some for sleep, some for energy, most unnamed. Of the bottles half hidden in cabinets, of long nights spent staring at old newsreels and murmuring phrases from state speeches he never delivered. The irony is that Farouk was, at times, self-aware. He once quipped that the world would soon be ruled by 5 kings: the King of England, the King of Hearts, the King of Spades, the King of Clubs, and the King of Diamonds. A cynical prophecy, and a correct one. He knew what he'd become. Not a ruler, but a symbol. A cautionary tale in real time. And so, perhaps to dull that knowledge, he turned further inward into the substances that softened memory, eased digestion, and quieted the voices, reminding him of who he once was. His death came suddenly, in 1965, after a lavish meal in Rome. Officially, it was a heart attack. Unofficially, speculation swirled. But by then, the cause almost didn't matter. The fall of Farouk had happened long before his final collapse. It began the day he mistook indulgence for identity, the day the palace became a cocoon, the day medicine became ritual, and ritual became dependence. And yet, Farouk was not an outlier. He was part of a lineage of rulers who, when confronted with modernity, chose intoxication over confrontation, who ruled briefly, fled quickly, and clung to their old selves in amber jars and amber liquids. And on the colder edges of Europe, in the gilded rooms of a quiet Danish court, another royal lived out a similar tale, less dramatic, less scandalous, but no less chemically padded. A prince whose court whispered of morphine and midnight musings, and whose addictions came wrapped in silken denial. Prince Valdemar of Denmark. There are royals who command the spotlight with declarations and drama. Then there are those who drift along the periphery, never quite at the center, but never quite out of view, occupying a role that is ceremonial on the surface, yet quietly self-destructive beneath. Prince Valdemar of Denmark belonged to the latter category. A man born into splendor, raised among empires, and eventually known less for diplomacy or duty than for the quiet, persistent cloud of rumor that followed him wherever he went, rumors involving opium, morphine, and the heavy perfume of aristocratic excess. The youngest son of King Christian IX, often called the father-in-law of Europe, due to the remarkable web of royal marriages he engineered, Valdemar came from a family that connected Denmark to nearly every other throne on the continent. His siblings and their descendants sat on the crowns of Britain, Greece, Russia, and Norway. It was, on paper, a dynastic jackpot. But dynasties, like any inheritance, come with expectations. And for a prince like Valdemar, neither firstborn nor particularly powerful, those expectations became a kind of gilded leash. He was raised as a naval officer, a respectable path for spare sons, and served in the Danish Navy with some distinction. By all accounts, he was intelligent, charismatic, and capable. But naval service in the late 19th century was a lifestyle of long silences and short bursts of ceremony. It offered plenty of time for solitude, reflection, and eventually habits. Those close to Valdemar noted early on his tendency toward retreat, physically, emotionally, and socially. He was often absent from major court events, preferring quieter company. In private correspondence, there are hints of persistent fatigue, recurring ailments, and vague references to treatments or necessary rest. It's within these euphemisms that his reputation slowly formed, not through scandal, but through whispers. The royal court, especially in Denmark, was not one for tabloid dramatics. Discretion was a virtue, and Valdemar was given ample space to live as he pleased. But his inner circle, including foreign diplomats and visiting dignitaries, began to take notice of certain patterns. At dinners, he was subdued. At public functions, he often arrived late or left early. Some described him as dreamlike, others as lost in his own atmosphere. These were the polite ways of saying what they suspected, that the prince was under the influence of something stronger than introspection. Opium was widely used among aristocrats of his era, not as a vice, but as a tonic. It came in the form of powders, tinctures, lozenges, and custom elixirs, prescribed for everything from indigestion to insomnia to what doctors then called melancholia. Morphine followed soon after, emerging as a medical marvel, one that promised precise pain relief and gentle sedation. It was clean, elegant, and disastrously addictive. Valdemar, it seems, favored both. There are no official medical records. Royal files were, and still are, closely guarded. But diaries from those around him paint a portrait of a man increasingly reliant on external comfort. Servants spoke of custom-prepared teas and private cabinets in his personal quarters. Fellow officers noted his tendency to excuse himself mid-conversation, returning more relaxed, more affable, and markedly less present. Aides described the scent of medicinal oils clinging to his rooms and the silence that often followed his withdrawal from gatherings. But it was never explosive. Valdemar didn't implode in scandal or collapse in public view. His addiction, if it can be called that, was slow, ceremonial, and socially insulated. In many ways, it reflected the culture of his class. Dignified on the surface, quietly unraveling underneath. He never abdicated, never disgraced himself, never sought attention. In fact, it's that very quiet that makes his story so telling. It's easy to imagine that he didn't even realize the shift himself. One dose to sleep, another to steady the nerves, a third for the headache caused by the second. Before long, the line between necessity and ritual vanished. Valdemar died in 1939 at the age of 80, having outlived most of his siblings and the old European order that had defined his youth. The world that once dressed him in naval regalia and bowed as he passed was long gone, replaced by republics, revolutions, and radically different expectations for royalty. But his legacy lives in a strange in-between space, not scandalous enough for gossip, not heroic enough for legend. Just another prince who slipped quietly into the background, dulled by privilege, pain, and the pharmacological haze that made both bearable. And yet, his story resonates because the next royal didn't hide in silence. He built castles in the sky, floated above the laws of physics and finance, and slipped into something far more dramatic than quiet addiction, madness, they said, or vision, or maybe just too many drops of something strong at the wrong time. His name was Ludwig. His kingdom was Bavaria, and his descent was as theatrical as the opera houses he built. King Ludwig II of Bavaria. By the end, King Ludwig II of Bavaria wasn't so much ruling a kingdom as haunting one. He was born into a world of castles and Catholic grandeur, the kind of monarch whose childhood was filled with royal tutors, opera lessons, and long lectures on constitutional restraint. None of it stuck. From the beginning, Ludwig was different, dreamy, detached, brilliant, maybe, or maybe just lonely, the kind of prince who saw more truth in mythology than in parliamentary procedure. And over time, that detachment, That soft insistence on fantasy over reality became more than a personality quirk. It became his entire reign. He ascended the throne in 1864 at just 18 years old and immediately began drifting not away from duty exactly, but away from political reality. He avoided Munich. He avoided ministers. He avoided people, for the most part. Instead, he poured himself into architecture, music, and private dreams. He built castles, literal ones, on mountaintops and in forests, each more elaborate than the last. Neuschwanstein, Herrenchiemsee, Linderhof. Monuments not to Bavaria, but to Ludwig's imagination, to a version of kingship that had never existed outside of Wagnerian opera. And behind those walls, high above the reach of public accountability, something else was taking hold. There are records, quiet, administrative ones, that suggest Ludwig began relying on various medicinal aids early in his reign. They were prescribed for sleep disorders, nervous excitement, and melancholic dispositions in 19th century Bavaria. Those diagnoses were the polite scaffolding around what we would now recognize as severe anxiety, depression, or possibly something more complicated. His physicians, constrained by the limitations of the time and the boundaries of royal deference, offered the only treatments available: strong sedatives, herbal extracts, opiate-infused tonics, and barbiturate precursors designed to make sleep come more easily and mornings less violent. And Ludwig took them. Night after night, retreating further into velvet-draped solitude, the king dosed himself with concoctions that blurred the line between therapy and escape. In his private chambers, he often refused to see people during the day. Preferring to conduct royal business after midnight, he surrounded himself with candles, music, mirrors, and carefully prepared drinks. The exact recipes remain unknown, but journals mention morphine, chloral hydrate, and other narcotic agents that would have subdued his nervous system while dulling the edge of isolation. But his need for sedation was only one part of the equation. Ludwig didn't just want to feel better, he wanted to not feel at all, at least not in the way ordinary people did. He longed for transcendence, for beauty that obliterated thought. He once wrote in a letter, "I wish to remain an eternal enigma, both to myself and others." Mission accomplished. As his reign progressed, his behaviors became increasingly erratic. He spent more and more state funds on his castle's vanity projects, according to his ministers, and began isolating himself completely. He communicated through notes, refused visitors, ordered elaborate meals for 10 and dined alone. Rumors swirled that he was losing touch. The Bavarian government grew uneasy. But those close to the king had another theory. He wasn't mad. He was medicated. There were whispers that Ludwig had become dependent on his nightly cocktails of sedatives and pain relievers, not just to sleep, but to think. That his emotional extremes, his euphoria, his despondency, his volatile reactions weren't signs of psychosis, but symptoms of chemical mismanagement. In one letter, a courtier described the king as being in a state of unshakable serenity followed by unpredictable melancholy. Another described his eyes as glassy but aware. By 1886, the government had had enough. A team of physicians, none of whom had personally examined him, declared him mentally unfit to rule. He was forcibly removed from power and placed under state supervision. The diagnosis? Paranoia. The justification? His spending, his isolation, his behavior. His medication was hardly mentioned. 3 days later, he was found dead in Lake Starnberg, alongside one of his doctors. The official report said drowning. But there were no signs of struggle, no water in his lungs, and no conclusive evidence of what happened. Just a dead king, a dead psychiatrist, and a kingdom that breathed a quiet sigh of administrative relief. Ludwig became a legend overnight. The mad king, the romantic visionary, the doomed dreamer. His castles turned into tourist attractions, his life into a myth. But the reality is less poetic. It's the story of a man who couldn't reconcile the weight of power with the fragility of his mind, and who sought refuge not just in fantasy, but in the subtle, numbing pull of chemical comfort. He wasn't the first monarch to medicate the pain of sovereignty, and he wouldn't be the last, because centuries earlier, in the palaces of Persia, another ruler just as grand, just as troubled, was turning to opium for reasons far less romantic and far more political. A Shah with ambition in his veins, poison in his goblet, and a growing dependence he could neither admit nor quit. Shah Abbas I of Persia. If King Ludwig II of Bavaria built castles in the sky, then Shah Abbas I built an empire in mirrors brilliant, ornate, and always reflecting back the image he wanted the world to see. In the golden age of the Safavid dynasty, Abbas reigned not just as a king, but as a symbol, a warrior, a reformer, a strategist, and a devout Shia ruler who wore piety like armor. But like most polished empires, the real story was written not in gold leaf, but in the fine lines of habit, contradiction, and chemical indulgence. Shah Abbas the Great ruled from 1588 to 1629, and great wasn't just flattery. He relocated his capital to Isfahan and turned it into one of the most dazzling cities of the early modern world. He built mosques that shimmered with turquoise tile, bazaars that stretched for miles, and palaces with ceilings like inverted stars. He opened Persia to foreign trade, welcomed European merchants, and reformed his military into a professional standing army. He centralized power, broke the influence of the feudal lords, and crushed rebellions with surgical efficiency. He was, by all public accounts, a monarch at the height of his powers. And yet, privately, Abbas was haunted. The demands of empire, the constant suspicion, the betrayals, the shifting alliances left deep grooves in his psyche. Like many absolute rulers, he became increasingly distrustful of those closest to him. He had sons executed for perceived disloyalty. He rotated advisors so frequently that his inner circle became more of a revolving door than a court. To those outside his palace, he was decisive. To those within, he was unpredictable. Some historians describe Abbas's later years as a descent into solitude and suspicion, but the real transformation may have been slower and more chemical. Contemporary accounts, both Persian and European, mention the Shah's frequent use of soothing elixirs and medicinal drafts, especially as he aged. The records are careful, coded in the language of royal dignity, but the substances described opium mixed with saffron, wine laced with herbal sedatives, and resins burned for inhalation leave little to the imagination. These weren't casual indulgences. They were rituals, repeated with increasing frequency, prescribed by palace physicians who understood that calming the king was a matter of national stability. Abbas, like many rulers of his time, didn't see this as weakness. In fact, the Safavid court had long embraced opium as both medicine and mystic key. It was said to open the gates of divine insight, ease the burdens of the body, and soften the edge of war. For a ruler who had spent decades consolidating power through violence and religious reform, the idea of spiritual sedation held a powerful allure. The use of opium in Persian high society during the Safavid era was not secretive. Nobles, scholars, poets, and courtiers regularly partook in opium-smoking gatherings known as nashast, where conversation flowed alongside smoke. In these settings, The line between recreation and reliance blurred easily. What started as cultural expression could quietly become a nightly necessity. But for Abbas, the issue wasn't the opium itself, it was how it interacted with his growing isolation. As he aged, his paranoia deepened, the court shrank, decision-making slowed. Some accounts describe long periods where the Shah was unreachable, his attendants offering only vague explanations about his need for rest or spiritual preparation. During these times, foreign envoys were often turned away or kept waiting for weeks. The Grand Shah of Persia, who once dazzled emissaries with his sharp wit and cutting diplomacy, became more elusive, less a man, more a ghost within his own empire. There are conflicting reports about his physical health in his final decade. Some say he suffered from chronic pain. Others suggest neurological symptoms, tremors, disorientation, fatigue that could be attributed either to age or long-term opiate use. He became increasingly reclusive, retreating into his palaces for longer stretches. The administrative machine of the Safavid state continued, but with less energy, less vision. The empire didn't collapse under his rule, but it began to drift. Abbas died in 1629, at the age of 57. His legacy remains mixed, revered as a builder of Persia's cultural identity and remembered as a reformer, yet also known for his cruelty, his suspicion, and the darker turn his court took in its final years. His body was buried in Kashan, far from the palaces of Isfahan, in a modest tomb that contrasts sharply with the grandeur he once commanded. But perhaps that's fitting. Abbas ruled a world built on contrasts, beauty and brutality, religion and paranoia, power and retreat. His use of opiates wasn't scandalous by the standards of his time, nor did it define his reign, but it colored its end, softened it, muted it, turned what might have been a sharp exit into something more like a slow dissolve. And from the Persian silk-draped chambers of the 17th century, we move forward again back to Russia, where another prince, not quite royal but rich in blood and scandal, carried his own collection of substances, secrets, and whispers. A man who danced with death and claimed to have killed it while possibly nursing addictions of his own, Prince Felix Yusupov of Russia. If history were a masquerade ball, Prince Felix Yusupov would be the man in the most elaborate mask, the one who never removed it, not even when the music stopped. Though not a royal by title, Yusupov belonged to the uppermost rung of Russian aristocracy, a place where wealth outpaced restraint and legacy outran accountability. His family was richer than the Tsars, his palaces more opulent, his reputation more scandalous. And yet, behind the silks and scandals was a man quietly sinking into obsession, into paranoia, and possibly into something much heavier than champagne. Felix was born in 1887 into one of Russia's oldest and most aristocratic houses. The Yusupovs were fabulously wealthy, with a pedigree that spans centuries and an art collection that rivaled Europe's best museums. They owned palaces in Moscow, estates in Crimea, and more diamonds than most royal vaults. But what set Felix apart wasn't just the money, it was the performance. From a young age, he played with identity the way others played piano. He wore women's clothing to society balls, assumed personas, and crafted a life that felt more like theatre than biography. Later, he would write of this period with a strange combination of pride and detachment, as if narrating someone else's life. But underneath the glamour, a pattern began to emerge, a tendency toward escape, intoxication, and theatrical self-medication. His university years in Oxford, glossed over in most official biographies, were filled with what his contemporaries called experiments. He reportedly dabbled in hashish, ether, opium, and early chemical stimulants that were making their way through European high society. To his peers, these were eccentricities. To Felix, they were tools, ways of stepping outside himself. He spoke of visions, of heightened perception, of feeling untethered from the expectations of his lineage. But what began as experimentation evolved into dependence. By the time he returned to Russia, Yusupov was carrying more than just custom-made luggage. He brought with him habits of late-night dozing, of secret rituals, of chemical escapes from the crushing weight of family, identity, and history. And perhaps most significantly, he brought with him a kind of theatrical disdain for consequence, a belief that nothing was truly real unless it was being witnessed, narrated, or consumed. Then came Rasputin. The infamous Siberian mystic had become a fixture in the imperial court, particularly close to Empress Alexandra and the ailing heir, Alexei. To the Yusupovs, and to much of the Russian aristocracy, Rasputin represented everything that was wrong with the empire. Mysticism over reason, chaos over order, outsider influence over noble heritage. Felix became obsessed not just with removing Rasputin, but with performing that removal. And in December 1916, he did. Or at least, that's the story he told. The assassination of Rasputin is one of the most mythologized events in Russian history, and no version of it can be entirely trusted. What we do know is that Yusupov was at the center of it. He lured Rasputin to the Moika Palace under the guise of a private meeting. What followed, depending on which version you believe, involved poisoned wine, gunshots, beatings, drowning, and a considerable amount of improvisation. But behind the violent theatre was something quieter and possibly more disturbing. Some historians believe Yusupov was under the influence during the event not just of ideology or ego, but of actual substances. Diaries and letters from the time reference medicinal aids and state of altered resolve. In private letters discovered years later, a close friend remarked cryptically, "Felix had prepared himself as he always did for clarity," he said, but his hands were trembling the whole night. It's unclear what he took. Morphine was common. Hashish tinctures too. Whatever it was, it helped him push through what he later described as a necessary ritual. That word ritual is telling. For Yusupov, even murder had to be theatrical, and theatre, by definition, requires props. After the revolution, he fled Russia with his wife, Princess Irina, and a few suitcases of jewelry. They settled in Paris, where Felix became a relic of a vanished world. He gave interviews, wrote memoirs, sold heirlooms, and according to those who knew him, continued to medicate his way through the slow death of the old aristocracy. Parisian friends noted his moods, his bursts of charm followed by long silences. He rarely ate much, but always had a glass in hand, though no one could agree on what was in it. Some said absinthe, others, opiates dissolved in alcohol. He smiled a lot, but never with his eyes. He died in 1967, old, wealthy, and still spinning stories. No official record lists addiction on his death certificate, no scandal ever quite stuck. But beneath the brocade and bravado was a man who had once danced with hallucinations, self-delusion, and pharmacological comfort. A man who had killed history's favorite mystic, only to spend the rest of his life trying to explain why it mattered. And now, from the glittering salons of Imperial Russia, we step further back in time to a different empire, more ancient, more primal, to a ruler whose legacy is equal parts music, madness, and mayhem, a man whose every feast was a theatre of intoxication and who, even in Rome, made excess look like divine right. Emperor Nero of Rome. If ever there was a sovereign who turned decadence into a state ideology, it was Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known to most as simply Nero. Emperor of Rome from 54 to 68 CE, Nero was not just infamous, he was operatic. His reign has been remembered less for policies and more for performances, less for governance and more for spectacle. And woven into that spectacle, into the orgiastic banquets, the midnight races, the costume stage appearances, was a quieter, more insidious theme. The presence of ancient intoxicants, psychoactive concoctions, and the slow, ceremonial erosion of judgment under the influence of ancient chemistry. Nero's image in history is as theatrical as it is polarizing. Depending on which Roman historian you trust, Suetonius, Tacitus, Dio, Cassius, you get different versions of the same chaotic figure, a man who fiddled as Rome burned, who married both women and men in elaborate ceremonies, who sang on public stages in a city where emperors were not meant to sing, and who, when the mood struck him, would disappear for days into private rituals with a small circle of sycophants and servants. But for all the fire and brimstone tales, there's a quieter story beneath the surface, one about mood, perception, and the substances that might have shaped them. Roman elites in the 1st century had access to a pharmacy of natural intoxicants. Poppy-derived mixtures, often combined with wine, were readily available and used to ease pain, sleep, anxiety, and, occasionally, conscience. Myrrh, henbane, mandrake, and cannabis extracts were also part of the Roman medicinal world. These were not necessarily taboo substances. They were prescribed, exchanged, even gifted among the elite. The line between medicine and indulgence was often blurred, especially among those powerful enough to escape scrutiny. Nero, raised in the serpentine halls of palace politics, had been groomed in these traditions. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, was a political schemer with her own reputation for dosing rivals and manipulating minds. It would not be surprising if Nero, raised at the feet of ambition, learned early on the subtle arts of pharmacological control both over others and himself. As emperor, he surrounded himself with Greek physicians, personal apothecaries, and philosophers who understood the body not as a fragile vessel, but as a tool for pleasure, transcendence, and dominance. Nero's legendary banquets were less about gluttony and more about transformation environments designed to stretch time, blur identity, and dissolve hierarchy. Music, light, incense, and, reportedly, mind-altering mixtures were carefully orchestrated to induce a sense of divine elevation. The ancient Roman term for opiates was papaver somniferum, sleep-bringing poppy, and it appears often in writings of the time, not just as medicine but as spiritual lubricant. Nero's contemporaries wrote of his strange mood swings, bouts of euphoric generosity followed by violent paranoia, sudden poetic inspiration giving way to fits of rage. His increasingly erratic behavior, while often chalked up to madness, might also reflect the long-term effects of these substances, especially if consumed without moderation. Then there were the theatrical performances. Nero fancied himself not just a ruler, but an artist. He took to the stage in Greco-Roman tragedies, performing for hours, sometimes days, refusing to let audiences leave. This wasn't just ego, it was ecstasy. Nero wasn't merely playing a part, he was entering a state. These performances were often preceded by ritualistic preparation, including incense, wine, and medicinal herbs, according to observers. It is entirely plausible that Nero used psychoactive substances to reach what he considered an elevated creative state. In fact, in some Greco-Roman religious circles, This was encouraged especially in mystery cults, like those of Dionysus or Eleusis, where hallucinogenic drinks were used to commune with the divine. But Rome is not forgiving, especially to emperors who blur the line between performance and policy. As Nero's behavior grew more erratic and his enemies multiplied, his inner circle began to shrink. He trusted fewer advisors. He turned inward, spending long nights composing music, writing poetry, and drifting between lucidity and vision. His decisions became harder to justify. Executions increased, senators fled. Eventually, even his own guards abandoned him. In the final days of his life, Nero fled Rome, hiding with a few remaining loyalists. Reports from this period again, filtered through hostile historians, describe a man in collapse, disoriented, muttering lyrics to himself, occasionally weeping, occasionally laughing, often silent. Some describe him as in a haze. Others say he had stopped eating, stopped sleeping, and was consuming a variety of tinctures to calm his nerves. The end came not with fire, but with fear. Nero's death marked the close of the Julio-Claudian dynasty and the beginning of civil unrest. But what lingers more than the political aftermath is the image. The fallen emperor, once hailed as divine, now reduced to a trembling figure shaped by performance, paranoia, and perhaps something even simpler, chemical escape. He remains one of history's most infamous examples of the intoxicated sovereign. But the modern age would see its own reflections of Nero equally tragic, equally theatrical, and equally dulled by the glittering edge of a glass. One such figure wore tiaras instead of laurel wreaths, danced in ballrooms instead of colosseums, and descended not through flames, but through the slow, graceful spiral of champagne and pills. Her name was Margaret. Her title was Princess. Her story no less imperial. Princess Margaret of the United Kingdom. If Queen Elizabeth II was the embodiment of royal restraint, duty-bound, controlled, unflappable, then her younger sister, Princess Margaret, was the crack in the porcelain. The human reminder that royalty, for all its silk gloves and stiff protocols, is still flesh and flaw underneath. She lived under the same crown, but not the same expectations, which meant, inevitably, she broke different rules. And when she broke them, she did it with crystal stemware in one hand, a pill bottle in the other, and a cigarette dangling at just the right cinematic angle. Margaret Rose Windsor was born into privilege so deep it was practically mythological. Her childhood was spent in palaces, her adolescence under the looming shadow of World War II, and her young adulthood beneath the suffocating weight of her sister's rising star. When Elizabeth became queen in 1952, Margaret's life changed in ways no constitution ever outlines. She wasn't just the spare anymore, she was the royal wildcard, and everyone expected her to act like one. She obliged. The post-war years had left Britain emotionally exhausted. The empire was shrinking, the streets were grey, and austerity was the order of the day. Into this backdrop stepped Margaret, all cocktail gowns and jazz records, driving fast cars and dating forbidden men. She was glamorous in the old Hollywood sense, and tragic in the quietly British way, never quite where she was supposed to be, and always just on the other side of royal protocol. But it wasn't just rebellion, it was anesthesia. By her late 20s, Margaret was already showing signs of the two great enemies that would follow her for the rest of her life: depression and dependency. The first was never officially named royals. After all, didn't talk about mental health in the mid-20th century, but it hung over her like London fog. The second was harder to hide. Her drinking, which started as celebration, quickly became routine. And the pills, mostly sleeping aids, painkillers, and tranquilizers, entered her life through the front door, prescribed by royal physicians who preferred their patients sedated and their scandals minimized. Margaret suffered from migraines, insomnia, and chronic anxiety, all of which were treated in the typical fashion of the 1,952nd and 62nd. With pharmaceuticals strong enough to knock out a cavalry regiment. By her 30s, she was reportedly taking barbiturates to sleep, stimulants to wake, and alcohol to bridge the hours in between. It was a lifestyle that looked like freedom from the outside but felt like a cage from the inside. The royal family, in its ever-practiced silence, said little. Her public image was maintained with a mix of curated photo ops and whispered excuses. When she slurred her words at banquets or stumbled out of clubs, the palace press team framed it as fatigue, not intoxication. When she disappeared from public life for stretches of time, it was for rest, not recovery. But the people who knew her really knew her, saw the pattern. Friends described a woman who could be magnetic one moment and morose the next. Her charm was legendary, but so were her moods. At parties, she held court like a queen in exile, witty, sharp, and increasingly self-medicating. She joked about her habits, even as they began to erode the sharpness of her presence. She once quipped, "I have a flair for flamboyance and a tendency to self-destruct," as if to preempt the headlines. Her marriage to photographer Anthony Armstrong Jones Lord Snowdon briefly promised stability, but it quickly dissolved into mutual resentment, affairs, and more public embarrassment. The divorce, finalized in 1978, was the first for a senior royal since Henry VIII, and it marked a symbolic end to whatever post-war fairy tale Margaret's life had once resembled. By the 1,982nd and 92nd, her health had begun to fail. Years of drinking and prescription drug use had taken their toll. She suffered strokes, lost partial mobility, and spent long periods in near isolation. The same palace that had once tried to hide her lifestyle now quietly braced for its consequences. And yet, even in her later years, Margaret maintained the same stubborn streak that had defined her youth. She refused to give up smoking. She kept drinking, albeit less visibly. And she rarely, if ever, acknowledged the role her habits played in her decline. She died in 2002, just 7 weeks before the Queen Mother. The headlines were respectful, the obituaries tinged with nostalgia and a hint of sadness. But behind the formal tributes was the unspoken truth. Margaret had lived a life not just of rebellion, but of escape. Escape from expectation, escape from loneliness, escape from a system that offered privilege in exchange for silence and delivered more isolation than comfort. She was not an addict in the tabloid sense. She was a royal in pain, reaching for whatever would make that pain quieter, if only for a few hours. And she found those hours in glasses and capsules, in country house weekends and blackout curtains drawn tight. But the palace curtains aren't the only ones that hide royal indulgence. A little farther south, across the Mediterranean, another king was fighting his own demons behind mirrored sunglasses, under layers of wealth, and whispered rumors of white powder. His kingdom was Morocco. His name was Hassan, and his secrets were as carefully preserved as the dynasty he ruled. King Hassan II of Morocco. Power wears a different face in the desert. Where European monarchs drowned in champagne and protocol, King Hassan II of Morocco ruled with a different kind of drama, quieter, drier, more opaque. He didn't throw parties for attention. He hosted them to test loyalty. He didn't collapse in front of the cameras. He vanished behind them. His court, elegant and shadowed, was a place where truth bent to convenience and rumors were dressed in silk. And somewhere inside that palace, in the cool, thick-walled rooms of Rabat and Fez, there were whispers that the king, for all his composure and cunning, was not untouched by dependency. Born in 1929, Hassan II came into a world defined by colonialism and cloaked sovereignty. Morocco, still under French control at the time, offered its royal family little more than ceremonial purpose. But Hassan, brilliant, ambitious, and fluent in both Arabic poetry and French law, would change that. By the early 1962nd, he had maneuvered Morocco into full independence and assumed the throne after his father, King Mohammed V, died. From the beginning, he ruled not as a figurehead, but as a calculating monarch with absolute authority. And that authority was deeply, almost obsessively, personal. Hassan was known for his extraordinary memory, diplomatic tact, and political ruthlessness. He survived multiple assassination attempts, staged elaborate manipulations of the press, and reshaped Morocco into a kingdom that looked constitutional but functioned as an extension of his will. His charisma was undeniable. So was his paranoia, and as the years went on, both became harder to separate. The rumors about substance use didn't start in his early reign. In fact, during the 1962nd and 72nd, Hassan projected an image of regal discipline, sharp suits, careful words, a king who dined light and rose early. But those closest to the court noticed subtle changes over time. A certain glassiness to the eyes during long meetings, mood swings that were explained away as stress, an increased reliance on solitude, punctuated by sudden bursts of social energy. By the late 1982nd, the whispers began to crystallize into quiet consensus. King Hassan was using something, perhaps several things, to navigate the pressures of monarchy. Cocaine was the most persistent rumor, not in the garish, nightlife way one might associate with celebrity, but in a controlled, utilitarian form. The kind used to sustain long hours of focus, sharpen perception, and suppress the exhaustion of ruling an unstable country for decades. Journalists and diplomats who visited the palace spoke always off the record about his electrified presence, especially during late-night meetings that stretched into dawn. They mentioned the king's extraordinary clarity and speed of speech, and the fact that no one ever saw him tired. Of course, none of this was confirmed. Moroccan state media, tightly managed by royal oversight, never acknowledged anything of the sort. But exile communities, former aides, and foreign intelligence files all paint similar pictures. A monarch who relied not just on surveillance and strategy to maintain power, but possibly on a pharmacological edge. And then there was the matter of sleep. Like many authoritarian rulers, Hassan kept an irregular schedule. He often conducted meetings well past midnight, made decisions in the early hours, and reportedly slept only a few hours a night. His insomnia was legendary, so too were the mixtures used to treat it. Foreign physicians, often brought in discreetly, prescribed sedatives and tranquilizers. Some were standard, others experimental. There were reports of injections before long public appearances, of vials delivered by trusted attendants, of meticulously controlled dosing to ensure maximum clarity followed by maximum collapse. He was also known to host marathon private gatherings, intimate, exclusive, and carefully choreographed. These were not parties in the traditional sense. They were more like rituals. Invitations were coded, guest lists politically revealing, and the evenings themselves were thick with both elegance and tension. Stories from these nights almost always included two elements: exquisite food and an undercurrent of something less visible, a kind of chemical stillness that seemed to blanket the palace. What's remarkable is how well he maintained control. Even under the influence, if he truly was, Hassan never unraveled in public. His speeches remained sharp. His foreign policy, though controversial, was sophisticated. He brokered delicate truces, outmaneuvered rivals, and kept Morocco largely stable, while neighboring nations fell to coups and chaos. But power, even when it functions, takes a toll. And behind the king's famously stoic face was a man who carried the weight of decades of repression, surveillance, and unrelenting image management. Whether he used substances to escape that burden or to reinforce his ability to bear it remains an open question. He died in 1999, after 38 years on the throne. The official cause: natural complications from illness. The unofficial analysis: a man who ruled until his body could no longer keep pace with his will. Even now, his legacy is split. Some call him a genius strategist, others a tyrant. But almost all agree on one thing: he was always in control. Or, at the very least, determined to appear that way. The illusion of control, however, is its own kind of dependency. And no one knew that better than the next monarch in our story, a king famed for elegance, indulgence, and a quiet reliance on medicinal opiates that turned into something much heavier. A man whose final years were spent not in royal triumph, but in a haze of morphine and ritual denial. His name was Edward, his crown was British. And his body, like so many before him, betrayed him long before his reign ever could. King Edward VII of the United Kingdom. By the time King Edward VII finally ascended the British throne in 1901, he had already lived what most would consider several lifetimes. The son of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, he spent over 6 decades as heir apparent, trapped in the long shadow of a mother who reigned with severity and rarely smiled. Edward, known to his family as Bertie, responded in the only way a Victorian prince with time, wealth, and very little political agency could. He indulged. And then he kept indulging. Edward VII was the original playboy prince. Before the term existed, before tabloid culture found its teeth, he was its living prototype. Lavish parties, endless travel, extravagant wardrobes, and a social calendar that made diplomats sweat. He was rotund, charming, fluently multilingual, and almost always just slightly overdressed. His hobbies included yachting, gambling, cigar collecting, and maintaining what seemed like a personal registry of every high-end restaurant in Europe. But beneath the tailored suits and easy wit was a man increasingly held together by a quiet but growing reliance on medicinal aids, especially in the final years of his life, when the years of excess began to exact their price. To understand Edward's relationship with narcotics, one has to first understand the medical landscape of the late Victorian and Edwardian eras. Opium and its derivatives were not only legal but widely prescribed, even for the most minor ailments. Morphine, in particular, was seen as a modern miracle, a clean, injectable version of pain relief that allowed even aging monarchs to maintain appearances while their bodies faltered behind the curtain. Edward, whose health began visibly declining in his 62nd, was no stranger to these prescriptions. He suffered from chronic bronchitis, lumbago, rheumatism, and perhaps most famously, excessive weight gain that exacerbated nearly every other condition. By the time he became king, the cost of a lifetime of gourmet dinners and leisurely living had begun to show. Doctors prescribed him tonics, powders, and eventually morphine, particularly for pain in his joints and difficulty sleeping. It began, as it always does, in moderation. A small injection before formal events, a tincture before bed, a dose to ease the back pain before riding in a carriage for hours on end. But gradually, the pattern changed. The doctors who travelled with him noticed that he increasingly requested medication not just for pain, but for mood, for energy, for sleep, for clarity, and they obliged, because who tells the king no? Those close to him started noticing subtle changes. He was more irritable in the mornings, slower to respond in council meetings, and visibly detached in some public appearances. His famously quick wit dulled around the edges. He sometimes repeated himself. Aides quietly noted that the morphine doses were increasing, though no one dared to say it aloud. The British press, as always, remained silent. The monarchy was sacred, and Edward's public image, jovial, approachable, paternal, was maintained with near military precision. But behind palace walls, the truth was becoming harder to ignore. His appetite remained enormous, but his energy was dwindling. His once effortless charm began to feel performed. The man who had once defined royal elegance now required help standing for long periods, and often skipped official events entirely under the guise of mild illness. It wasn't scandal, it wasn't collapse, it was erosion. Even as his health declined, Edward refused to slow down. In 1909, during a state visit to France, he reportedly required morphine injections both before and after formal dinners, just to remain upright and lucid. These weren't theatrical overdoses or whispered addictions. They were methodical, medically sanctioned accommodations for a body that could no longer keep pace with its royal obligations. He died in 1910 after a series of heart attacks, at the age of 68. The official cause of death was listed as bronchitis and heart failure. But by then, the morphine had long since become part of the routine, another quiet tool of monarchy, like the crown itself. Something heavy, necessary, decorative, and, in the end, unsustainable. Edward VII left behind a redefined monarchy, more modern, more public, more human, but also, perhaps, more fragile. His reign had been brief, only 9 years, but his influence was massive. He was the bridge between the stiff Victorian era and the chaotic 20th century, a king who smiled more than he ruled, and who masked his slow unraveling with grace and chemistry. And just beyond the British Isles, on a different continent and under different skies, another monarch faced a very different sort of exile, one that came not from revolution, but from imperial betrayal. A queen without a kingdom, confined to a foreign land, slowly numbing the ache of memory with morphine. Her crown was lost, but her dependencies remained. Her name was Ranavalona, and her story unfolded far from the palaces of Europe, in the fading corners of a stolen kingdom. Queen Ranavalona III of Madagascar. If there's anything lonelier than losing a throne, it's losing one before anyone believed you deserved it. Such was the strange, bittersweet fate of Queen Ranavalona III, the last monarch of Madagascar, young, poised, idealistic, and ultimately powerless. Crowned queen in 1883, exiled in 1897, and quietly forgotten by much of the world not long after, Ranavalona's story is one of ceremonial authority wrapped around a hollow core. The French took her crown. They took her country. But the emptiness they left behind that stayed with her, and over time, it was that emptiness that she tried, quietly and politely, to dull. Born Razafindrahiti, Ranavalona wasn't meant to rule. She was an educated noblewoman, fluent in French, with a refined sensibility and a strong spiritual devotion to the Protestant faith. But when Queen Ranavalona II died and her successor quickly followed, the throne came to her by way of royal succession and political necessity. The French were already circling. Madagascar's independence, always precarious, was slipping fast. Ranavalona III was crowned in a ceremony drenched in tradition, wrapped in red silk and ancestral songs. But it was mostly theatre. The French had no real interest in honouring Madagascar's sovereignty. They installed a resident general, flooded the capital with soldiers, and by 1896 declared the island a French colony. 1 year later, the monarchy was officially abolished. Rana Valona, once a symbol of national resistance, was escorted out of her palace, down to the port, and onto a French ship. She would never return. Her exile began in Algiers. The French chose Algeria for its distance, climate, and colonial familiarity. Rana Valona was given a villa not luxurious, but comfortable. Her royal title was stripped, but the colonial administration allowed her to live with some dignity. She had servants, a modest allowance, and a carefully monitored public image. To the French press, she was a relic of a bygone era, exotic but tamed, a deposed queen who drank tea and posed politely for photographs. But beneath that surface, her world was shrinking. Her homeland was gone, her language silenced, her religion increasingly foreign in a Catholic colony. The people around her spoke in French, but never to her. She had no court, no advisors, no power, just memories, and the creeping realization that they too were beginning to erode. And so came the medicine. Records from this period, mostly letters, journals, and medical receipts, suggest that Rana Valona began receiving regular treatments for nervous exhaustion and melancholic disturbances. Colonial physicians, eager to present her as docile and content, prescribed what was typical for women of her rank and condition: bromides for anxiety, sleeping powders, herbal sedatives, and, increasingly, morphine. At first, it was likely prescribed for insomnia. A few drops in a cordial glass before bed. Then for migraines. Then, perhaps, for the persistent ache of homesickness, the kind of pain that lingers in the bones and refuses to explain itself. Over time, morphine became not just a treatment, but a routine. A gentle way to dull the hours between breakfast and dusk. A way to disappear without leaving the room. Those close to her noted her increasing stillness. She spent long afternoons sitting by the window, looking out at the sea. She rarely left the villa. When she did, it was often for short walks, always accompanied, always composed. Her letters grew shorter, her handwriting more careful. She rarely spoke of Madagascar in public anymore. When asked, she would smile and say something neutral, something rehearsed. In 1910, the French government moved her to France itself, first to a residence near Marseille, and later to a quiet estate outside Algiers once again. By then, she had become a ghost in the colonial imagination, a former queen without a country, dressed in lace and silence. Her final years were defined by a kind of graceful sedation. No dramatic scenes, no outbursts, just quiet routines. The same chair, the same walks, the same measured doses. Morphine wasn't scandalous. It was expected. Colonial society saw it not as addiction, but as refinement. A lady's escape, a queen's private mercy. Rana Valona III died in 1917, not in a palace, not even in her own land, just quietly, in exile, her heart failing after years of slow forgetting. They buried her with honours French ones, a ceremony in Algiers, a procession attended by colonial officials. Later, her remains were returned to Madagascar and reinterred with royal respect. But the gesture was hollow. Her kingdom had vanished, her palace emptied, her language all but erased. Her morphine use was never discussed publicly. It wasn't scandalous enough, and it fit too neatly into the French colonial narrative of the tamed royal. But for those who looked closely, it was a symptom of exile, of powerlessness, of identity dissolved in a chemical hush. And not far from Madagascar's haunted memory, in another part of the world where thrones blurred into temples and kings into gods, one prince stood at the edge of two worlds, raised in incense and ritual, but living in a court where opium seeped through the gilded walls. His name was Chulalongkorn. His title, Rama V. And before he became a reformer, he too was a royal son of smoke. King Chulalongkorn, Rama V of Thailand. Before Thailand was Thailand, it was Siam, a kingdom of glittering temples, sacred elephants, and absolute monarchs, cloaked in both divine authority and human contradiction. And among these kings, Chulalongkorn, or Rama V, stands as one of the most transformative. He abolished slavery. He modernized the bureaucracy. He sent his sons to study in Europe and even dared to trim the ritual distance between monarch and citizen. But for all his bold reforms and diplomatic finesse, there was a quieter chapter early in his life that history has largely chosen to footnote. A time when the royal court itself was steeped in smoke ritual, perfumed, and often opium-laced. Chulalongkorn was born in 1853, the favored son of King Mongkut. Yes, that King Mongkut, the one immortalized, however inaccurately, in The King and I. Raised in a palace that was part spiritual sanctum, part political machine, Chulalongkorn's early life was shaped by Buddhist scholarship, royal etiquette, and a court that believed deeply in both traditional medicine and sacred intoxication. Opium, in mid-19th century Siam, was not yet the international villain it would later become. It existed in a strange, liminal space, part medicine, part indulgence, part divine sacrament. It was used by monks for meditation, by healers for pain, and by royals for everything from insomnia to spiritual alignment. And in the palace, it was simply there, embedded in the culture like jasmine garlands and formal bows. Young princes, including Chulalongkorn, would have been exposed to opium not as a vice, but as an accepted part of the ceremonial and medicinal fabric of court life. There are passing references in court documents and memoirs of the era to evening tonics and relaxation smoke, often consumed during long philosophical discussions or religious festivals. These weren't secret indulgences, they were structured rituals conducted under the watchful eyes of palace physicians and spiritual advisors. Chulalongkorn, by most accounts, partook in these rituals during his youth. Whether out of curiosity, tradition, or social expectation, he participated in the court's opium culture just as he participated in its politics and poetry. But something shifted as he grew older. Perhaps it was his exposure to European governance during his travels abroad. Perhaps it was the realization that a kingdom can't modernize while sedated. Because once he became king in 1868 at the age of just 15, he slowly began to dismantle the very culture that had shaped him. Over the following decades, Rama V moved decisively to reduce opium dependency in the court and beyond. He began by regulating its sale, restricting its availability, and launching a slow, careful cultural campaign to sever the drug from the national identity. He didn't ban it outright, not yet, but he reframed it. He took it out of the temples, out of the ritual chambers, and into the jurisdiction of government inspectors and medical authorities. And in doing so, he may have been trying to rewrite his own narrative. Because while official biographies now portray him as a reformer from day one, there's enough quiet documentation to suggest that Chulalongkorn understood the drug's allure from the inside. He had lived in the haze. He had walked through the perfumed parlors where the real business of court was conducted behind half-lidded eyes and whispered stories. And he knew what was at stake. Not just health, but sovereignty. Thailand, then Siam, was one of the few Asian nations to resist colonization. And it did so not just with diplomacy, but with strategy. Chulalongkorn understood that presenting Siam as civilized in the eyes of Europe meant shedding the image of royal indulgence. Opium, with its slow rhythm and foreign associations, had to go. Or at least, it had to hide. By the end of his reign in 1910, the opium culture of the court had been significantly reduced. The drug was still present in Siamese society, particularly among labourers and immigrants, but it no longer defined the palace. Chulalongkorn had reframed kingship not as divine intoxication, but as enlightened governance. And in doing so, he left behind a strange, paradoxical legacy. A king who may have partaken, but who also pulled the plug on the entire performance. Still, the memory lingered, like incense that clings to the drapes long after the prayer is finished. And while Chulalongkorn's relationship with opium may have been transitional, one foot in the past, one in the future, the next royal on our list plunged straight into the storm. Her world was not one of gentle rituals or cautious reforms, but of sudden trauma, public collapse, and desperate chemical solace. She was a European empress in a foreign empire, caught in a spiral of grief and treatment, and her name Carlota would echo through the halls of a palace that was never truly hers. Empress Carlota of Mexico. Some stories begin with a coronation and end with an abdication. Carlota's began with a fantasy and ended in a locked room. Born a Belgian princess and married to Archduke Maximilian of Austria, Carlota was cultured, intelligent, and fiercely ambitious. She read philosophy. She wrote fluent French. She played the harp. She believed, as many did in that era, that royalty was both a calling and a cure. So when Napoleon III of France offered her husband the imperial crown of Mexico in 1864, backed by French troops and an eager conservative Mexican faction, Carlota saw not an empire in crisis, but a grand, romantic project. She was 23. What followed was less a reign and more a beautifully scripted nightmare. Maximilian and Carlota arrived in Mexico to find a country already divided, bleeding from years of civil war. The so-called empire was fragile, opposed by Republicans led by Benito Juarez and held together only by foreign bayonets. Still, Carlota threw herself into the role of empress with remarkable energy. She toured schools, met with indigenous leaders, tried to reconcile factions, and projected the image of a benevolent, maternal sovereign. She believed in the empire. She believed in her husband. She believed the world would reward conviction. It didn't. By 1866, the French withdrew their troops. Napoleon III had lost interest. The empire collapsed almost overnight. Maximilian, refusing to flee, was captured and executed by firing squad in 1867. Carlota, already in Europe seeking help, never returned to Mexico. Some say she never fully returned to herself either. Her mental breakdown was swift and devastating. She became paranoid, delusional, convinced that she was being poisoned, that people were trying to kill her. She stopped eating. She stopped sleeping. And so, in the manner of European royalty facing inconvenient suffering, she was not treated, she was hidden. Doctors diagnosed her with a nervous affliction. She was moved between castles in Belgium and Italy, carefully monitored and increasingly sedated. The medical treatments of the time were blunt instruments, bromides, opiates, chloral hydrate, and morphine, especially morphine. At first used sparingly to calm her nerves, then administered more regularly as her episodes intensified. Her letters from this period, those few that survive, are fragmented and eerie. Some are lucid, others spiral into looping phrases, frantic invocations, and cries for help. She feared darkness. She feared mirrors. She feared being alone, yet could not tolerate company. Morphine, prescribed to stabilize her, likely deepened the dreamlike unreality she already inhabited. She lived like this not for months or years, but decades. Carlotta spent over half a century in seclusion. She died in 1927 at the age of 86, still referred to by some as Her Majesty, though her empire had vanished before most of her doctors were born. The world moved on. Mexico became a republic. Austria fell. The age of empires dissolved into memory. But Carlotta remained frozen in time, embalmed in routine, soothed by a regimen of chemicals that blurred each day into the next. Her addiction was never called by its name. That would have been impolite. Instead, it was treatment, calmative support, necessary measures. But in truth, the Empress spent the majority of her life wrapped in sedation, not to escape scandal, but to survive grief. A grief so large, not even a palace could contain it. And as her twilight years dwindled in quiet hallways and perfumed gowns, another European king far to the north was also numbing a slower kind of pain. Not grief, but degeneration. Not collapse, but chronic decline. And like Carlotta, he turned to the old faithful. Opium-based tonics, prescribed with formality and consumed with increasing familiarity. His name was Leopold. His kingdom was Belgium. And by the end, it wasn't just his policies that were under scrutiny, it was what he was putting in his teacup. King Leopold I of Belgium. There are monarchs remembered for founding nations, and there are monarchs remembered for what those nations later became. King Leopold of Belgium, the first sovereign of the modern Belgian state, belongs to the former category, but with the uneasy hindsight that history always supplies, he built the foundations. He unified a country split between languages and religions. He was careful, controlled, and impossibly well connected. But he was also a man burdened by chronic pain, a string of personal losses, and a slow, quiet descent into chemical dependence. Born a German prince in 1790, Leopold was royalty before Belgium was even an idea. His early years were spent navigating the complex world of European alliances. He married Princess Charlotte of Wales, the beloved daughter of King George IV, only to watch her die tragically young in childbirth. That loss devastated him. The British public mourned Charlotte, but Leopold carried her ghost with him for the rest of his life. In 1831, after the Belgian Revolution severed the region from the Netherlands, Leopold was invited to become the first king of the new constitutional monarchy. He accepted. He ruled. And he ruled well, at least by 19th century standards. He maintained neutrality, modernized the military, and managed to walk a delicate tightrope between Catholic and liberal factions. But none of it came easily. The Belgian monarchy was a balancing act, and Leopold was a man not built for constant balancing. He was, at heart, a melancholic. The king's personal health was a subject of quiet concern almost from the start of his reign. Letters and court records describe frequent nervous episodes, digestive ailments, migraines, and long periods of fatigue. He consulted with doctors regularly, and, as was typical for a European royal of the time, he was prescribed a steady rotation of medicinal aids: laudanum for the nerves, opium tinctures for pain, alcohol-infused tonics for circulation. These weren't taboos. They were protocol. Physicians of the day saw opium as a gift from the gods, versatile, calming, and indispensable. For a monarch juggling political pressure and physical discomfort, it was almost inevitable. Leopold reportedly began using laudanum regularly in the 1842nd. At first, it was episodic, taken for headaches, gout flare-ups, or nights of particular anxiety. But over time, the pattern solidified. His staff noticed a decline in energy. He sometimes postponed meetings. He grew more irritable, more detached. His handwriting became shakier in later letters, and he often referenced the need for calm or a fog of weariness that would not lift. His public image remained intact, dignified, statesmanlike, a father of a fragile nation. But in the privacy of his palace, it seems the king was increasingly reliant on the chemical stillness that opiates provided. There's no evidence he was ever incapacitated by it, no scandals, no visible collapse. But the clues are there, buried in the quiet language of his correspondence and the increasingly frequent visits from royal physicians. He died in 1865 after a series of health complications related to heart and lung issues. Officially, his cause of death was natural. Unofficially, it's likely that decades of subtle, sanctioned opiate use had taken their toll, numbing pain, yes, but also masking symptoms until it was too late. Leopold is remembered today as a foundational figure, less colourful than his successors, but crucial to Belgium's creation. Still, his story is also a reminder that even kings who hold nations together can come undone in private, in slow motion, one carefully measured drop at a time. And not far away, in another palace, another monarch wore a crown he had no intention of honouring. He outlawed vice with one hand while secretly indulging with the other. A sultan of contradictions, of public piety and private excess, who knew the price of addiction but paid it anyway. His name was Murad IV, and his hypocrisy was as legendary as his empire. Sultan Murad IV of the Ottoman Empire. If you were caught drinking alcohol during the reign of Sultan Murad IV, you might lose more than your cup. You might lose your life. The Sultan was notorious for his harsh bans on drinking, smoking, and opium use throughout the Ottoman Empire. His laws were brutal and his punishments swift. He patrolled the streets of Istanbul in disguise, ordering executions for violators. He styled himself a restorer of moral order, a warrior against vice. And yet, behind the heavy doors of the Topkapi Palace, Murad was violating every edict he ever enforced. He was, in every sense, a walking contradiction. Born in 1612 and crowned at the age of 11, Murad IV inherited an empire in chaos. The Ottoman state was plagued by internal corruption, external threats, and palace intrigue so poisonous it made European courts look almost democratic. Murad, placed on the throne by a scheming regency council, and his powerful mother, Kazım Sultan, spent the early years of his reign as a figurehead. But by the time he reached his 20s, he had seized full control, and with it, the paranoia that absolute power so often breeds. To restore discipline, Murad turned the empire into a police state. Alcohol was banned. So was tobacco. Opium, once used medicinally and socially among Ottoman elites, became a target of his purges. Taverns were shuttered, hashish dens were raided, and yet, according to court insiders, none of these rules applied to the Sultan himself. Murad, it was said, drank heavily. He hosted private feasts that lasted until sunrise. He smoked opium in secret chambers guarded by eunuchs and loyal guards. When questioned, he justified his indulgence as divine privilege. The ruler, after all, was not bound by the rules of his subjects. His body was the empire. What he consumed was his own concern. Historians remain divided on how deep his dependency ran. Some argue his substance use was occasional, a tool for managing stress, a private ritual, not a full-blown addiction. But others point to descriptions of his mood swings, his erratic decrees, and his growing isolation in the final years of his reign. Reports suggest he suffered from liver disease, likely brought on by years of alcohol abuse. His temper became infamous, Courtiers tiptoed around him, unsure whether they would be rewarded or executed. He was a brilliant general. His campaign to recapture Baghdad from the Safavids was one of the great military triumphs of his reign, but even on campaign, the opulence followed. Tents filled with musicians, dancers, wine, and pipes. The contradiction was never more visible. The warrior sultan delivering sermons against vice in the morning and indulging it in the evening. By the time of his death in 1640, Murad was only 27 years old. His health had deteriorated rapidly. Some sources list cirrhosis as a probable cause, though the official narrative blamed natural causes. He left no heir. His brother, Ibrahim, later known as Ibrahim the Mad, took the throne, and the empire descended once again into chaos. Murad IV is remembered as a restorer of imperial authority, but also as a tyrant. His laws were strict, his punishments cruel, his hypocrisies monumental. And perhaps that's the most fitting legacy of all. A ruler who outlawed intoxication while ruling from within it, who demanded purity from his people while chasing escape in secret. And just beyond the Ottoman gates, in a Europe struggling to define itself, another king was fumbling through public appearances with a laudanum bottle in his pocket. A monarch whose hangovers were as legendary as his unsteady proclamations. His name was Victor Emmanuel II, and his rule was as chemically clouded as it was historically celebrated. King Victor Emmanuel II of Italy. Unification is a noble word, clean, aspirational, drenched in national pride. But in the case of King Victor Emmanuel II, unification came with hangovers, contradictions, and more than a few glasses of laudanum-laced brandy. Crowned the first king of a united Italy in 1861, Victor Emmanuel was elevated to icon status in schoolbooks, statues, and patriotic folklore. He was father of the fatherland, the mustache symbol of Risorgimento success, galloping proudly through a patchwork of once fractured city-states. But beneath the marble pedestal was a very different man, flawed, often disoriented, and increasingly medicated. Born in 1820 to Charles Albert of Sardinia, Victor Emmanuel came from a long line of rulers with more interest in tradition than reform. He was a soldier by training, and his instincts often leaned more toward the cavalry than the constitution. Still, he managed to survive revolutions, foreign invasions, and political betrayals to become the first monarch of modern Italy. It was a legacy forged in battles and treaties, but sustained, for him personally, by an increasingly elaborate medicinal routine. Court records and private correspondence reveal a man struggling with chronic health issues long before his political triumphs. He reportedly suffered from frequent migraines, digestive problems, and what his physicians politely referred to as nervous conditions. A term that, in 19th century medical code, could mean anything from anxiety to depression to early signs of neurological decline. To treat this rolling storm of ailments, Victor Emmanuel was prescribed a now familiar regimen, laudanum, a potent opium tincture mixed with alcohol and diluted with sugar or wine. He also took herbal tonics, sedatives, and on occasion, stronger formulations imported from French or Austrian pharmacies. These weren't recreational choices, they were royal standard. The line between medicine and indulgence didn't exist for monarchs of his era. If the king needed to get through a speech, a meeting, or an international negotiation, he was handed a cordial glass or a small phial. No scandal, no questions. His physical presence was required. His clarity was optional. And clarity, in Victor Emmanuel's case, was increasingly rare. In the later years of his reign, aides and foreign diplomats began to notice his erratic behavior. He would arrive at events late or visibly distracted. He sometimes repeated himself or drifted off mid-conversation. His public addresses, once robust, became shorter and more stilted. Aides chalked it up to fatigue or the stress of governing a newly unified and deeply fractured country. But those closer to the court knew better. The medications were no longer occasional, they were hourly. In private, the king relied heavily on his personal physician, who travelled with a case full of tinctures, powders, and injectable solutions. Morphine had begun to replace laudanum in some cases, especially for nighttime pain, and brandy, never far from his table, acted as both catalyst and cover. Even his meals, described in court journals, became erratic. Long stretches of indulgence followed by near fasting, another sign of the push-pull between sedation and lucidity. Still, the machine of monarchy marched on. Victor Emmanuel presided over Italy's emergence as a nation-state. He navigated wars, papal hostility, and shifting political alliances, but as Italy stabilized, he weakened. By the mid-1872, he had become increasingly reclusive, conducting most affairs of state from his residence and rarely appearing in public without a heavy entourage. His health was visibly deteriorating, and the doctors, still armed with more opiates than answers, continued to prescribe what amounted to slow-motion escape. He died in 1878, and the official records gave the usual explanations: complications from disease, exhaustion, natural decline. But the traces of long-term medicinal dependency were visible to those who had watched the king recede, year by year, into a haze of royal quiet. Victor Emmanuel II remains a hero in Italy's national myth. His tomb rests in the Pantheon in Rome. His statue stands in the shadow of the Vittorio Emanuele II monument, Il Vittoriano, colossal and gleaming. But none of that reflects the soft, blurred man behind the uniform. The monarch who drifted through his last years on doses meant to preserve dignity, but which slowly dissolved his grasp on the country he helped create. And in a different part of Europe, another heir to a fractured empire was slipping down a similarly narcotic path, though his end would come not in quiet decline, but in a storm of scandal, conspiracy, and tragedy. A crown prince addicted to morphine and heartbreak. A royal whose death would echo through history, like a pistol shot behind a locked door. Crown Prince Rudolph of Austria. There are royal deaths, and then there are royal detonations. Crown Prince Rudolph of Austria, only son of Emperor Franz Joseph I and heir to the vast Habsburg Empire, didn't just die, he collapsed. In a cloud of mystery, scandal, and speculation that still haunts European history over a century later. And at the center of that slow-motion disaster was a man already unraveling through obsession, disillusionment, and an all-too-familiar cocktail of barbiturates, morphine, and emotional instability. Born in 1858, Rudolph was never quite the crown prince his father wanted. Where Franz Joseph was rigid, stoic, and militaristic, Rudolph was intellectual, liberal, and deeply melancholic. He read Darwin. He corresponded with philosophers. He sympathized with democratic reforms. In short, he was a walking crisis for a monarchy that valued obedience above all else. From a young age, Rudolph exhibited signs of what his tutors euphemistically called a nervous temperament. He suffered from insomnia, recurring migraines, and emotional volatility. His letters oscillated between euphoria and despair, and he often described feeling separated from life, even in moments of triumph. By his early 20s, he had already been introduced to opiate-based medications, first for physical complaints, then for the psychological ones. What began as mild doses of laudanum became more potent formulations over time. Morphine injections became routine, especially during periods of depression. and barbiturates newly emerging in European medicine were used to manage his increasingly erratic sleep patterns. Combined with alcohol and a steady stream of stimulants prescribed to counteract lethargy, Rudolf was trapped in a pharmacological tug-of-war. Lifted, lowered, sedated, stimulated, but never truly stable. His personal life didn't help. Married to Princess Stephanie of Belgium in a politically arranged union, Rudolf quickly grew cold and distant. He embarked on a string of affairs, most notably with Baroness Mary Wetzera, a 17-year-old noblewoman who became his confidant, obsession, and eventual co-conspirator in tragedy. By the late 1882, Rudolf was convinced that his father would never allow him to rule. He felt trapped in an empire that seemed determined to ignore the future and bury the present in ritual. In January 1889, Rudolf and Mary Wetzera were found dead at Meerling, the Crown Prince's hunting lodge. The official report called it a murder-suicide. Rudolf allegedly killed Mary before turning the weapon on himself. But the details were murky, and the imperial court moved quickly to sanitize the event, destroying letters, sealing files, and constructing a public narrative that leaned heavily on illness and temporary madness. What they never publicly acknowledged, but what many now believe, was that Rudolf's mental state had been steadily deteriorating due to long-term substance dependence. Morphine and barbiturates, especially when combined with alcohol, are known to produce emotional volatility, paranoia, and suicidal ideation. Friends reported that in the weeks leading up to Meerling, Rudolf was alternately euphoric and despairing, often unable to sleep for days at a time, then sleeping for days more. The signs were all there. The palace just didn't look. After Meerling, the Habsburgs closed ranks. Rudolf was buried quietly, without full honors. Mary's body was whisked away and hidden for decades. The empire stumbled on, haunted by the shadow of a prince who saw the future too clearly and couldn't bear it. He wasn't just a tragic figure. He was a chemical one. Shaped, dulled, and eventually shattered by the very medications meant to make him manageable. And next, we turn to another Belgian royal, one painted as heroic on the battlefield, but who also fought a quieter, more personal war with painkillers and trauma. A man revered for his bravery and remembered, perhaps unfairly, without mention of the morphine that helped keep his courage intact. His name was Albert I, and his battlefield wasn't the only place he tried to feel less pain. King Albert I of Belgium. Some monarchs live in mirrors, reflections, traditions, appearances. King Albert I of Belgium lived in trenches. Known to history as the Soldier King, Albert I reigned from 1909 until his sudden death in 1934, and his image, stoic, upright, modest, was carefully cultivated as a symbol of national resilience. During World War I, when most royal heads of state remained cloistered in distant command rooms, Albert rode to the front lines with his troops. He wore a uniform instead of a crown. He stood in muddy boots instead of marble halls. To his people, he was not just a ruler, he was Belgium. But behind that heroic image, frozen in black and white photographs and war poetry, was a man slowly fraying at the edges, not dramatically, not publicly, but privately, in silence, in pain, and with the help of substances that softened the sharp edges of his duties. Albert's path to the throne wasn't exactly planned. He was a quiet man, introspective, and generally uncomfortable with the spotlight. When his uncle, Leopold II, whose own reign was drenched in controversy, died in 1909, Albert inherited not just the crown, but the moral vacuum left behind. He was expected to restore dignity to the Belgian monarchy, and for a time, he did. He modernized the state, supported scientific exploration, and cultivated a public image of personal humility. Then came 1914. The German invasion of Belgium dragged the country into the First World War almost overnight. Albert took command of the Belgian army personally, refusing to flee to safety as other leaders had done. He became a symbol of resistance, featured in newspapers, journals, and Allied propaganda. But the trenches were not kind to anyone, not even kings. Albert sustained minor injuries during the war, nothing life-threatening, but enough to cause chronic pain in his back and legs. He also suffered from the accumulated stress of war leadership, sleep loss, neural fatigue, and what we would now recognize as symptoms of PTSD. In a time when the medical establishment had few tools to deal with psychological trauma, the solution was painfully predictable: morphine. It was given liberally, often as part of the standard military medical kit. Albert, despite being monarch, was treated by army doctors who likely saw no issue in prescribing small, frequent doses to help him rest or manage discomfort. At first, it was likely minor, an injection after a particularly long day at the front, a sleep aid after a sleepless week, but the problem with morphine is never its first appearance. It's the second, and the 10th, and the 100th. Private correspondence from Albert's later years suggests a growing reliance. Letters reference nightly treatments, soothing tonics, and the doctor's necessary aid. Nothing ever explicit, nothing scandalous, just a pattern. Observers noted that his energy waned in the 1922nd, that his public appearances became less frequent, that he often looked distant during state functions. The morphine had become part of the architecture of his life, never named, never questioned. And yet, he remained beloved. When he died in 1934, a climbing accident falling from a rock face in eastern Belgium, his funeral drew crowds rarely seen for monarchs outside Britain. He was mourned as a hero, a unifier, a good man in an impossible time. No official investigation ever addressed his morphine use. There was no need. He hadn't failed. He hadn't fallen. He had managed, like so many rulers on this list, not to let his dependence define him, even as it slowly shaped him. But his story, noble as it was, wasn't unique. Because thousands of miles away, on another island nation once gripped by war, another royal suffered in silence, in private, with his own case of medically administered morphine. A prince not broken by battle but by what came after. Honor kept him quiet, pain made him reach for the needle, and his name was Prince Takamatsu, the younger brother of Japan's last emperor, Prince Takamatsu of Japan. In the carefully choreographed theater of 20th century Japanese royalty, emotion was not part of the performance. Pain, even less so. Everything, grief, anger, longing, was folded into ritual, cloaked in language, and hidden behind generations of imperial formality. Prince Takamatsu, born in 1905 as the third son of Emperor Taisho and brother to Emperor Showa, Hirohito, knew this theater well. He played his part with discipline and duty. But behind the palace gates and the lacquered screens, a quieter story was unfolding. One of physical suffering, psychological burden, and long-term dependence on morphine to manage both. Unlike his brother, Prince Takamatsu was not destined for the chrysanthemum throne, but he was close enough to it by blood, by rank, by expectation that he was treated as royalty in full. He was educated at the Naval Academy, trained in the martial values of the empire, and commissioned as a naval officer during Japan's turbulent pre-war decades. He served with distinction, if not enthusiasm. His own wartime diaries, released decades after his death, revealed deep discomfort with the militarization of Japan and unease over his brother's role in it. but his public face remained composed. Then came the war. During World War II, Prince Takamatsu served as a high-ranking naval officer. While he was kept away from direct frontline action, partly due to his royal status and partly due to internal politics, he was exposed to the deep psychological toll of the conflict. He traveled to battlefront regions, visited wounded soldiers, and received briefings that left no room for idealism. He knew the war was spiraling. He tried, quietly, to influence his brother to seek peace. But he failed. And in 1945, Japan fell. After the war, Takamatsu's role diminished. The empire was disbanded. The imperial family was reduced. Though he retained his title, his influence evaporated. And so did, in many ways, his purpose. Compounding this loss of role was his physical deterioration. Injuries some sustained during naval service, others acquired through illness, left him in chronic pain. By the late 1942nd, he was under the care of multiple physicians. Medical notes and family recollections suggest a regular regimen of morphine for nerve pain, migraines, and post-surgical complications. It was prescribed, managed, and administered within the strict discretion of the imperial household. But discretion is not a cure. Over the following decades, Takamatsu's public appearances grew rarer. He withdrew from public functions, his speeches became shorter, his letters more formal. The man who had once been a potential reformer within the imperial family now floated along its margins, distant, ghost-like, occasionally surfacing in carefully arranged photographs or ceremonial processions. His wife, Princess Kikuko, later confirmed that her husband had lived in significant pain for most of his post-war life. She did not speak of addiction, no one ever did, but she acknowledged the medications, the daily injections, the long nights, the slow disappearance of the man she had married. Prince Takamatsu died in 1987, just 2 years before the death of Emperor Showa. His funeral was respectful, restrained, and impeccably choreographed like every other moment of his life. The obituaries praised his naval service and his quiet dignity. No mention was made of the morphine. And yet, for those who knew how to read between the lines, the story was clear. He had survived the collapse of his world not with politics or protest, but with painkillers. Not with rebellion, but with resignation. A prince who tried to steer history in private and soothed its refusal with the only relief he could find. And so we move west once more, toward a king who outlived his throne and his reputation, whose exile came with secrets and whose quiet descent was punctuated by rumors of sleeping pills, barbiturates, and the kind of melancholy that no crown can protect you from. His name was Alfonso XIII of Spain, and his kingdom disappeared long before he did. King Alfonso XIII of Spain. The problem with being born a king is that you never get to learn how to become one. Alfonso XIII of Spain entered the world already wearing a crown, literally. He was proclaimed king the moment he was born in 1886. His father had died 5 months earlier, leaving a throne without a monarch and a monarchy without a plan. From his first breath, Alfonso was not just a child, but a national symbol. And like most symbols, he was treated more like an idea than a person. Spain, in the late 19th century, was a nation permanently out of breath, teetering between monarchy and republic, tradition and reform, relevance and decline. Alfonso came of age during one of the most chaotic stretches of Spanish history. Wars in Morocco, the loss of the last colonial possessions, internal revolts, anarchist violence, and a slow-burning identity crisis that seemed to infect the entire Iberian Peninsula. By the time he reached adulthood, Alfonso had developed a reputation as charming, clever, and pathologically restless. He loved automobiles, women, adventure, and ceremony. He also loved control, or rather, he hated the feeling of not having it. And somewhere amid the royal expectations, political betrayals, and national decay, Alfonso began turning to something quieter, more manageable, and far more predictable than politics: chemically assisted peace. The specifics are difficult to trace. As with most royal narratives, the court kept impeccable silence around his medical life. But persistent reports from courtiers, foreign diplomats, and later biographers suggest that during his later reign, and especially after his exile in 1931, Alfonso XIII began relying heavily on barbiturates, sedatives, and, at times, morphine. To sleep, to travel, and to cope. His decline wasn't spectacular. It was slow, polite, and carefully padded in velvet. After the collapse of the Spanish monarchy and the rise of the Second Republic, Alfonso fled the country without formally abdicating, an ambiguity that suited his personality. He settled in Rome, drifting between private villas, diplomatic gatherings, and long stretches of silence. He was a king without a kingdom, a patriarch without a family dynasty, and a man whose political instincts had failed him at nearly every turn. In exile, his habits deepened. Insomnia, anxiety, and depression, the royal trifecta, were treated, as they always were, with a pharmacy's worth of calming agents. His staff prepared tonics and draughts. French doctors were flown in. Spanish ones were quietly dismissed. The pattern was familiar: pills to sleep, something else to wake, and more to keep the pendulum from swinging too violently in either direction. Those who visited him during this time noted his peculiar detachment. He remained outwardly regal, still charming, still fluent in multiple languages, but often seemed miles away in conversation. He would lose the thread, stare at nothing, or offer answers that felt oddly rehearsed. Sometimes he talked of returning to Spain. Other times he insisted he had never truly left. Biographers have speculated that his long-standing reliance on sedatives may have dulled his sense of time, of place, even of grief. His political legacy was in tatters. His family was fractured. And yet he drifted through his final years as if watching someone else's life unfold. The barbiturates, many believe, had become a filter between him and the world, a gauzy curtain drawn over a failed monarchy. He died in 1941, alone in exile, days before his son Juan formally renounced claims to the throne in Franco's New Spain. Alfonso was buried not in Madrid, but in Rome. A monarch remembered more for what he lost than what he ruled. And though history rarely names it, the soft descent of Alfonso XIII was not just political, it was pharmaceutical. He numbed the silence of exile the only way he knew how, with a regimen that blurred days into evenings, regret into forgetfulness, and history into hush. But while Alfonso slid quietly into chemical retreat, the next emperor on our list descended with fire, fury, and a deeply personal devotion to the narcotic leaf that fueled his final unraveling. His empire was in the Highlands, his rage legendary, and his chosen substance far older than any European tonic. His name was Tewodros II of Ethiopia, and his kingdom was not lost gently. Emperor Tewodros II of Ethiopia. There are rulers who lose their empires in exile, and then there are rulers who go down swinging. Emperor Tewodros II of Ethiopia belonged to the second category, a man of staggering ambition, volatile genius, and a temperament that could change direction faster than a highland wind. He wanted to modernize Ethiopia, centralize its power, and bring it into the modern world. And for a time, he almost succeeded. But power, especially when worn by a man with a messianic vision, becomes dangerous in isolation, and Tewodros became very isolated. Born Casa Haile Gorgeous in the early 19th century, he rose from the ranks of regional nobility to unify Ethiopia under his rule in 1855, adopting the imperial name Tewodros II. He launched military campaigns, built a new capital, and reached out to European powers, hoping to bring Ethiopia into a modern diplomatic orbit. He even dreamed of manufacturing weapons domestically, setting up foundries with foreign engineers. But his dream was undermined by paranoia, betrayal, and personal demons. And among those demons, one grew particularly sharp. Khat, a mild stimulant plant native to the Horn of Africa, and a series of traditional narcotics that were widely used among the Ethiopian elite for both ceremonial and recreational purposes. Khat is not, in the clinical sense, a hard drug. Its leaves are chewed for hours, producing a stimulant effect that ranges from alertness and euphoria to agitation and obsession. In small doses, it's social. In large doses, especially when used to self-medicate chronic anger or anxiety, it becomes corrosive. Tewodros, already known for his unpredictable temper and brutal disciplinary methods, began relying more and more on Khat during the later years of his reign. Court records and foreign observers noted his all-night rants, days spent pacing, and sudden outbursts that terrified both allies and enemies. Letters written by European diplomats at the time describe an emperor both brilliant and unhinged, a man who could quote scripture one moment and order mass floggings the next. His Khat use was often combined with traditional herbal mixtures, some of which were sedative, others psychoactive. Ethiopian medicine in the 19th century blended spiritual healing with pharmacology in ways that defied neat categories. These weren't Western drugs in glass bottles. They were concoctions brewed from centuries-old recipes, strong, ritualistic, and, when misused, deeply destabilizing. The emperor's mental state deteriorated alongside his political situation. His diplomatic overtures to Britain soured after a series of miscommunications and perceived insults. He imprisoned British officials. The British responded by launching a military campaign. By 1868, the writing was on the wall. Tewodros retreated to his mountain fortress at Magdala, fortified it, and prepared for war. He gave dramatic speeches. He summoned prophets. He chewed Khat late into the night, surrounded by loyalists who dared not question his logic. He refused all offers of negotiation. For him, there was no compromise, only martyrdom or victory. The British Army, vastly better equipped, stormed the fortress with minimal resistance. Tewodros, refusing to be captured, died by his own hand before they could reach him. The British looted Magdala and carried away treasures, but the emperor's body was buried with full honours, his enemies still recognising, even in death, the gravity of the man they had defeated. And yet, behind the heroism and tragedy, there remains the quieter truth. Tewodros II may have been undone not just by politics or military miscalculation, but by the narcotics that clouded his judgment, fed his delusions, and kept him suspended in a world that no longer obeyed him. He ruled like a prophet, fell like a rebel, and numbed the terror of collapse with ancient stimulants that still echo through Ethiopian highlands today. And so we turn northward to a man who knew madness not in theory, but as daily experience. A Danish king medicated into docility, shadowed by manipulation, and slowly dissolved in opium by the hand of his own physician. His name was Christian VII, and he was monarch in name only, King Christian VII of Denmark. Some monarchs rule empires. Others become empires unto themselves, battlegrounds of politics, medicine, and myth. King Christian VII of Denmark was crowned in 1766 at the age of 17, a moment meant to usher in a new era of youthful vigour for the Danish-Norwegian throne. Instead, It marked the beginning of a decades-long unraveling, both political and personal, fueled by instability, court manipulation, and an almost medicinal relationship with opium. Christian VII's reign is remembered less for policy and more for pathology. Almost from the start, it became clear to those around him that the young king was not well. He suffered from what contemporary accounts called melancholy, nervous agitation, and disturbed thoughts. Modern historians have speculated that he may have lived with schizophrenia, severe bipolar disorder, or a form of neurodevelopmental disorder, but those diagnoses are retrospective shadows, hovering over the scant medical notes and scandalous gossip of the time. The court's solution to his volatility was predictable: sedation. And in 18th century Europe, sedation meant opium. From his early 20s, Christian's daily life became increasingly medicated. At first, opiates were used to calm his anxieties and insomnia. Later, they were used to blunt his outbursts and render him more compliant to the will of those around him, namely, his personal physician Johann Friedrich Strenzy, a German doctor who would become both the de facto ruler of Denmark and the architect of one of the most bizarre royal triangles in European history. Strenzy saw opportunity in Christian's vulnerability. Not content to simply manage the king's health, he began managing the king's decisions. With Christian doped into passivity for most of the day, Strenzy stepped into the vacuum, signing edicts, issuing reforms, and amassing unprecedented power. He introduced Enlightenment-inspired policies, abolished torture, and attempted to modernize Denmark's bureaucracy. For a time, it looked like he might turn a sedated monarchy into a progressive machine. But power built on sedation is never stable. At the center of this political experiment was Christian, physically present, mentally adrift. Contemporary reports describe him as alternately childlike and paranoid, sometimes laughing uncontrollably, sometimes hiding for days. He was often confused, disoriented, and emotionally numb. Much of this behavior was likely exacerbated by the heavy doses of laudanum and other opiate derivatives he was receiving, administered both for his supposed benefit and for the convenience of the court. Strenzy's influence grew even more controversial when he began a personal relationship with Christian's wife, Queen Caroline Matilda, the British-born sister of King George III. The affair was both political and personal, and the scandal it generated was more than the Danish nobility could tolerate. In 1772, a palace coup removed Strenzy from power. He was executed, Caroline Matilda was exiled, and Christian VII, still king in name, was placed under even tighter supervision. The rest of his reign was a study in controlled decline. For the next 4 decades, Christian remained technically on the throne, but he ruled nothing. His son, and later a regency council, made decisions in his name. His public appearances were rare and carefully orchestrated. Behind closed doors, he continued to receive opium-laced treatments for his nervous condition, and the doses, it seems, were never reduced. Visitors to the court often commented on his vacant demeanor. He would stare blankly, respond slowly, or giggle at inappropriate moments. Occasionally, he would show flashes of clarity, brief reminders of the man he might have been, but they never lasted. The opium had done its work, numbed the pain, dulled the edges, and erased the urgency of self. Christian VII died in 1808, a monarch so sedated that history barely remembers what he sounded like. His rule, such as it was, became a cautionary tale about medicine misused for politics, about autonomy erased for convenience, and about how a man can be preserved physically while being erased spiritually. And from the shadows of Danish palaces, we turn to another royal who danced between statesmanship and spectacle, revolution and recluse. A prince turned king, turned icon, turned enigma. And somewhere along that winding path, he, too, found chemical comfort in a world that no longer welcomed him. His name was Prince Norodom Sihanouk of Cambodia, and his nation was never more fragile than when he was sober enough to feel it. Prince Norodom Sihanouk of Cambodia. Very few people can say they've been king, prince, president, prime minister, and figurehead all in one lifetime. Norodom Sihanouk could, and did, often with theatrical flair and political ambiguity that baffled both allies and enemies. He was not just Cambodia's ruler, he was its mirror, its performance, its myth in human form. And like all great myths, he was larger than logic and often hard to follow without a painkiller. Born into royalty in 1922 during French colonial rule, Sihanouk ascended the throne as King of Cambodia at just 18 years old. He was expected to be a quiet monarch, diplomatically handsome, publicly ceremonial, and politically irrelevant. Instead, he became the opposite. Sihanouk played every role on the political stage. Over 7 decades, he would abdicate, return, flee, collaborate, resist, and somehow survive every regime change that Cambodia threw at him, including colonizers, communists, and coups. But behind the camera-ready smile and baritone speeches was a man carrying the weight of a nation that never stood still long enough to be ruled. And somewhere along the way, perhaps in the long Parisian nights of exile or the claustrophobic chambers of Chinese guest houses, Sihanouk began to lean heavily on morphine and alcohol to soften the contours of his impossible life. Unlike many royals on this list, Sihanouk's use of sedatives wasn't born from chronic illness or battlefield injury. It came, instead, from exhaustion, mental, emotional, existential. He had been everything, and it had taken everything from him. During his years of exile, particularly after the 1970 coup that ousted him and ushered in the Khmer Republic, Sihanouk was reportedly in a near-constant state of medicated fatigue. French medical teams prescribed morphine to help him sleep, to treat neurasthenia, an outdated diagnosis for general mental collapse, and to manage anxiety. Combined with his known consumption of alcohol, often during public interviews or late-night strategy sessions, Sihanouk began drifting through his own legend. Those close to him described a man whose moods were unpredictable. He could be charming and eloquent one moment, then withdrawn and unreadable the next. His speeches, once rousing, became rambling. His written statements began to carry a surreal, almost dreamlike tone, as if dictated from a different plane. And yet, he remained immensely influential. Even in sedation, he commanded loyalty. World leaders met with him. Rebel groups swore allegiance. Foreign journalists still treated him as the legitimate voice of Cambodia. But the man behind the title, the man reading cue cards through a fog of morphine, was increasingly disconnected from the Cambodia he claimed to represent. He returned to power briefly in the early 1992 after the Paris Peace Accords and UN-brokered elections, but by then he was visibly frail. Medical trips to China became frequent. His speeches were short and carefully scripted. Behind palace walls, a rotating team of Chinese doctors and personal aides maintained a strict regimen of treatment, part pain management, part sedation, part preservation. Sihanouk died in 2012 in Beijing, one of the last surviving Cold War-era monarchs. He was mourned by many as a father of the nation, a symbol of unity, a tragic hero. Few mentioned the drug. Fewer still acknowledged the quiet, chemical retreat that had defined so much of his later life. But the evidence remains in letters, in testimonies, in the long silences that replaced his once relentless speeches. And now, We look to a king who never saw his throne again, a man whose kingdom dissolved into sand and betrayal, exiled, broken, and slowly numbed by the very powers that once praised him. His name was King Hussein of Hejaz, and his final years were written not in gold, but in opium. King Hussein of Hejaz. In the grand cinematic sweep of 20th century Middle Eastern history, King Hussein of Hejaz is often reduced to a supporting role the noble father betrayed, the monarch outmaneuvered, the old man in exile, while new regimes rewrote the region. But in his own time, Hussein was a central figure in one of the most pivotal geopolitical gambles of the modern era. He led the Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire. He declared himself King of the Arabs, and for a brief moment he imagined a united Arab kingdom stretching from the Red Sea to the Euphrates. But the world does not reward idealists without armies. And Hussein, by the end, was not a king. He was a guest in Cyprus, a political relic whose dreams had been bartered away in European drawing rooms. His allies abandoned him, his sons inherited divided thrones, and his name slowly faded from relevance. And in that long twilight, what remained of King Hussein was a man in physical decline, spiritual despair, and according to both British records and family testimony, deep dependence on opiates to numb the steady erosion of his world. Hussein's relationship with the British was complex from the beginning. As Sharif of Mecca and head of the Hashemite clan, a lineage that traced back to the Prophet Muhammad, he was both a religious leader and a political chess piece. During World War I, he was promised Arab independence in exchange for leading a revolt against the Ottomans. Those promises were made in telegrams, sealed with vague assurances, and ultimately shattered by the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the Balfour Declaration. In other words, Hussein was useful, then expendable. After declaring himself King of the Arabs in 1916, Hussein briefly ruled the Hejaz, controlling the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. But his pan-Arab vision clashed with the rising ambitions of Ibn Saud in the Nejd. By the mid-1922nd, the two powers were at war, and Hussein found himself increasingly isolated, both militarily and diplomatically. The British, once eager to back him, began shifting their support toward the Saudis, deeming them more stable, more aligned with imperial interests, and less inclined to resist oil exploration. In 1924, as Wahhabi forces advanced on Mecca, Hussein abdicated in favor of his son Ali and fled. Not long after, he was forced into exile in Cyprus courtesy of the same British government that had once hailed him as a hero of liberation. And it was there, in that Mediterranean isolation, that the whispers began. Documents from British consular staff stationed in Cyprus refer discreetly to the king's increasing dependence on medication. Letters from family members describe his declining health, erratic mood, and persistent need for relief. The relief in question? Opiates administered in tinctures, pills, and liquid extracts. Initially prescribed for arthritis, insomnia, and digestive issues, the doses gradually became more frequent, more essential. In exile, Hussein received few visitors. His interactions were limited mostly to British officials, household staff, and occasional emissaries from his far-flung sons Faisal in Iraq, Abdullah in Transjordan. The man who had once rallied tribes and shaken empires now spent his days in a villa surrounded by silence, reading newspapers that barely mentioned his name. And the opiates dulled it all. There's no record of wild addiction, no tales of debauchery or public collapse. Hussein's dependence was quiet, dignified, and thoroughly tragic. He took the drops to ease the stiffness in his legs. He took them again when the letters stopped arriving. He took them when Ramadan passed uncelebrated, and when Mecca, the city of his lineage, became the jewel of another dynasty's crown. He died in 1931, having never returned to the Hijaz. His remains were later moved to Jerusalem and buried on the Haram al-Sharif, the very heart of a land still caught in the crosswinds of colonial promises and imperial disappointment. His dreams of Arab unity dissolved into borders and mandates. His sons ruled, but in British-approved boxes. And his legacy, much like his later life, was embalmed in silence, made bearable, perhaps, by those final, chemical comforts that softened the betrayal but could never quite erase it. But while Hussein's final days played out in exile and quiet surrender, the lineage of chemically entangled royalty continued across time zones, continents, and generations. Because long before him, at the very start of this list, another monarch was already experimenting with the same paradox. Power so absolute, it had to be medicated. And so we return to the beginning, to close the loop with a queen who held the world in her grasp and yet, at times, could barely sleep without a little help from the poppy. Her name was Queen Elizabeth I of England, and even Gloriana needed something stronger than resolve.